December 16th, 2004. An Amber Alert flashes across the Midwest, but the missing infant has never taken a single breath of outside air. A 23-year-old woman is found dead on her own living room floor in a pool of blood. Her abdomen has been violently sliced open, her 8-month fetus surgically extracted and stolen. It is a crime so visceral and deranged that seasoned investigators freeze at the threshold. A cradle sits empty, while a predator drives away with a stolen life. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Skidmore, Missouri, functioned as a quiet agricultural hub where the rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons rather than the news cycle. In late 2004, 23-year-old Bobby Jo Stinnett lived there, navigating the quiet expectations of a rural existence. She had married her husband Zeb the previous year, and the two occupied a modest, well-maintained home on a parcel of land where they pursued their passion, breeding and raising rat terriers. Bobby Jo was described by those who knew her as soft-spoken, deeply devoted to her dogs, and possessed of a gentle disposition. She was not a woman of great public ambition. Her world revolved around the immediate needs of her kennel and the small, personal milestones that define a young marriage. By the fall of 2004, that world was expanding. She was 8 months pregnant with their first child, a daughter they had already decided to name Victoria Jo. The pregnancy was a focal point of her days. She shared the news with enthusiasm within the online circles she frequented, communities dedicated to the breeding and showing of rat terriers. It was a digital extension of her local life, a place where she felt comfortable, supported, and connected to others who shared her specific obsession. Her home was an accumulation of preparations. Baby clothes were neatly folded, a crib stood ready in the nursery, and the final weeks of gestation were marked by the typical anxieties and profound anticipations of a first-time mother. Zeb worked long shifts as a machine operator at a local plant, meaning Bobby Jo spent significant hours alone at the residence. She was comfortable in this isolation. She was a fixture of the Skidmore community, a person whose day-to-day presence was as unremarkable as it was steady. There was no dissonance in her life, no conflicts that drew attention, no debts that threatened her security, and no enemies who sought her harm. Her engagement with the internet was primarily professional and social, revolving around the exchange of information regarding litters and health standards. She was active on specialized forums where, under her own name, she meticulously tracked the pedigree of her terriers. It was here that her path inadvertently crossed with someone else, someone whose presence in those forums was not born of an interest in dogs, but of a desperate, pathological craving for the life Bobby Jo was carrying. The psychological landscape of Skidmore was one of total trust. Neighbors rarely locked their doors during the day, and the idea that a predator might be observing the routine of a pregnant woman from behind a glowing computer screen was an alien concept. Bobby Jo existed in a bubble of rural safety, oblivious to the fact that her personal joy had become an object of intense clinical obsession for a stranger monitoring her updates from hundreds of miles away. She was preparing for a birth. The person watching her was preparing for a theft. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would dismantle the safety of the town and force the residents to acknowledge that malice could be imported into their isolated geography with nothing more than a dial-up connection. The early internet of 2004 was a largely unpoliced frontier, characterized by niche message boards where enthusiasts gathered in absolute trust. For specialized breeders, forums like Ratter Chatter served as digital town squares. Users uploaded pixelated photos of new litters, debated the merits of specific bloodlines, and openly shared milestones from their personal lives. It was an insular space, insulated by the assumption that everyone logging on shared the same harmless obsession. For the expectant mother in Missouri, interacting on these boards was a comforting daily ritual. She posted updates under her real name, documenting both the growth of her prize-winning terriers and the steady progress of her pregnancy. Among the screen names regularly interacting with her posts was a newcomer calling herself Darlene Fisher. The initial contact was innocuous, focused entirely on the dogs. Darlene claimed to reside in neighboring Kansas and expressed a deep admiration for the Missouri woman's breeding program. But the interaction quickly pivoted to a more intimate subject. Darlene presented a biographical detail carefully calibrated to lower any remaining psychological defenses. She stated she was also in her 3rd trimester, expecting her first child. This fabricated persona was a masterclass in predatory mirroring. By mimicking her target's exact biological and emotional state, the person behind the keyboard bypassed the natural skepticism usually reserved for strangers. The digital exchanges soon transcended animal husbandry. They discussed the physical exhaustion of late-stage pregnancy, the anxiety of impending motherhood, and the meticulous preparations underway in their respective nurseries. Darlene was profoundly attentive. She asked detailed, supportive questions regarding the baby's movements, the chosen color palettes for the crib, and the precise dates of upcoming medical appointments. Behind the glowing monitor of a desktop computer located 150 miles away in Melbourne, Kansas, sat the architect of this elaborate deception. The woman crafting the identity was a 36-year-old mother with a deeply fractured psyche. Her physical reality stood in stark, terrifying contrast to the joyful anticipation conveyed in her emails. Operating from a rural farmhouse, she was facing a catastrophic collapse of her personal life. A web of intense falsehoods she had spun over several months was rapidly unraveling, creating an urgent, inescapable crisis. She required an infant, not through the legal channels of adoption, but instantly, convincingly, and entirely off the grid. Her digital stalking was exhaustive. She studied the online footprint left by the breeder with clinical precision. By analyzing the backgrounds of the puppy photographs posted to the forum, she mapped the layout of the victim's home. She absorbed the daily schedules mentioned in casual chat threads, noting the long shifts worked by the husband at the local manufacturing plant. The predator understood that rushing the process would trigger alarm bells. Instead, she maintained a steady, patient cadence of friendly correspondence throughout the autumn. She positioned herself as a supportive confidant, a fellow expectant mother navigating the exact same physical milestones. This psychological alignment formed the bedrock of the trap. The victim believed she was nurturing a genuine friendship, completely unaware she was providing a detailed topographical map of her vulnerabilities to a stalker. As the calendar flipped to December, the digital relationship reached its calculated terminus. The online grooming needed to transition into the physical world. The premise for the face-to-face meeting was flawless, rooted entirely in the legitimate business of the kennels. Darlene Fisher expressed an urgent desire to purchase a puppy. She claimed to be looking for a specific coat pattern and temperament, details she knew would engage the breeder's professional pride and obscure any ulterior motives. Emails were exchanged to finalize the logistics. Darlene proposed driving up to the Skidmore residence to view the available litter in person. The timing was suggested casually, yet calculated with lethal precision. It was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, a specific window when the husband was guaranteed to be miles away on the factory floor, leaving his wife alone on the isolated property. The victim, seeing only a routine business transaction with a friendly online acquaintance, readily agreed. She provided turn-by-turn driving directions to her rural home, noting the specific landmarks off the main highway and the visual indicators of her driveway. She tidied her living room, secured the dogs, and prepared for a customer. On the morning of the scheduled meeting, a final email was transmitted across state lines, confirming the estimated time of arrival. The message was warm, brief, and entirely deceptive. The target was acquired, the location was secured, and the trap was locked. The virtual illusion was about to evaporate, replaced by the physical arrival of a woman who had packed her vehicle not with cash for a puppy, but with the grim instruments required to harvest a child. The temperature in northwest Missouri hovered just above freezing on the afternoon of December 16, 2004. A pale winter sun offered no real warmth, casting long, stark shadows across the barren agricultural fields bordering the town. Down the quiet stretch of the victim's street, a red Toyota Corolla slowed to a crawl. The vehicle crunched over the gravel driveway, parking near the modest single-story home. The driver stepped out into the bitter air. She did not look like a threat. She appeared exactly as she had portrayed herself online, a slightly heavy-set, unassuming woman in the late stages of pregnancy. She wore loose, accommodating clothing. She carried herself with the heavy, deliberate gait of an expectant mother. But beneath the fabric of her coat, secured and hidden from view, she carried a thick length of neon pink rope. Inside the residence, the homeowner was waiting. She had secured her larger breeding dogs in their rear enclosures, leaving only a select few puppies out in the main living space for the prospective buyer to examine. When the knock came, she opened the door without hesitation. The greeting was cordial. The two women moved from the cold entryway into the warmth of the living room. The layout of the house was compact, forcing a close, intimate proximity between the host and her guest. The conversation remained focused on the animals. The visitor played her role flawlessly, asking specific questions about the puppy's temperaments and bloodlines, feigning a deep professional interest. But her eyes were actively scanning the environment. She was checking the sightlines from the front windows. She was listening intently for the sound of a returning vehicle. The house was entirely isolated. It was completely silent, save for the muffled yapping of the terriers in the back room. The facade vanished in a fraction of a second. The transition from a casual business transaction to lethal violence was absolute. The young mother turned her back, perhaps to point out a specific dog, perhaps to retrieve a pedigree document from a nearby table. The guest moved with sudden, practiced speed. The neon pink cord was whipped out from beneath her coat. It went over the victim's head. It snapped tight across her throat. The struggle was not brief. It was a violent, chaotic, and agonizing fight for survival. The victim was heavily pregnant, carrying significant extra weight, and thrown completely off balance. But she fought with the raw, primal ferocity of a mother protecting her unborn child. She clawed desperately at the rope biting into her neck. She reached backward, tearing thick strands of blonde hair directly from her attacker's scalp. The two women slammed into the surrounding furniture. Knickknacks crashed to the floor. The physical exertion was immense. The attacker's hands gripped the ends of the cord with white-knuckled intensity, twisting the rope, pulling backward, and utilizing her entire body weight for leverage. The victim's air supply was entirely severed. Blood vessels in her eyes ruptured from the extreme pressure. The room echoed with the muffled, horrific sounds of a desperate fight for oxygen. Heavy scuff marks smeared across the linoleum floor as boots kicked and dragged. Eventually, the physiological lack of air dismantled the resistance. The young woman collapsed onto the living room floor. Her attacker did not let go. She maintained the agonizing tension on the rope, kneeling over the body, holding the ligature tight until every muscle twitched and finally ceased moving. The living room fell quiet again. Only the rapid, heavy breathing of the killer broke the stillness. Murder was not the primary objective. Murder was simply a necessary biological hurdle. The true goal was locked inside the victim's body. Time immediately became the critical factor. The fetus was actively losing oxygen with every passing second that the mother's heart remained stopped. The attacker abandoned the rope and sprinted to the kitchen. She bypassed the standard silverware and retrieved a sharp kitchen knife. She rushed back to the living room, dropping to her knees beside the lifeless body. What followed was a brutal, crude approximation of a cesarean section. There was no anesthesia. There was no surgical precision. There was only a frantic, mechanical butchery executed against the clock. The blade sliced downward through the fabric of the victim's clothing. It penetrated the flesh of her abdomen. Blood poured out onto the linoleum in a massive, pooling hemorrhage that quickly soaked into the carpeted edges of the room. The heavy, metallic scent of copper saturated the enclosed space. The cuts were deep, jagged, and reckless. The predator plunged her bare hands into the open abdominal cavity. She gripped the 8-month-old infant and violently pulled her out into the cold air of the living room. The baby girl was alive. The attacker severed the umbilical cord. She clamped the raw, bleeding end, ignoring the massive, catastrophic trauma she had just inflicted on the mother. She wiped the newborn down with a towel snatched from the adjacent bathroom. She wrapped the stolen infant tightly in a blanket. The entire extraction had taken only minutes. The intruder stood up. Her hands, her forearms, and her clothes were heavily stained with arterial blood. She walked straight out the front door, carrying the newborn, leaving the mutilated remains of her victim splayed open on the floor. She climbed into the red Toyota Corolla, started the engine, and backed quickly out of the driveway. The gravel crunched a final time. She merged onto the rural highway, accelerating north, putting miles between herself and the slaughterhouse she had just created. Inside the residence, the absolute silence returned. The afternoon sun shifted lower in the sky, casting long, dark shadows across the gruesome scene. Just after 3:30 p.m., Becky Harper pulled her vehicle into the driveway. She had spoken to her daughter earlier that day on the telephone. This was intended to be a routine visit, a quick daily check-in between a mother and her heavily pregnant child. Becky walked up the concrete steps to the front door. She turned the brass knob. It was unlocked. She stepped into the narrow entryway. The atmosphere inside the house felt immediately wrong. The temperature was off. The dogs were highly agitated, whining and pacing relentlessly in their enclosures. Becky called out her daughter's name. There was no response. She took a few more deliberate steps down the short hallway toward the main living area. Then, she saw the floor. The visual impact was paralyzing. Her daughter lay flat on her back. Her maternity clothes were completely saturated in a dark, rapidly coagulating pool of blood. Her abdomen was laid completely open, a horrific, gaping wound, exposing her internal organs to the air. The sheer volume of blood obscured the precise nature of the trauma. The human brain completely rejects anomalies of this magnitude. In her initial, blinding shock, staring down at the ruptured stomach, Becky's mind grasped for any logical medical explanation. She genuinely believed her daughter's abdomen had spontaneously exploded from the pressure of the pregnancy. Becky grabbed the nearest landline telephone. Her hands shook so violently she could barely punch the numbers. She dialed 911. The dispatcher answered immediately. The audio recording of that ensuing call captures the exact sound of a human psyche fracturing in real time. Becky screamed into the receiver. She wildly informed the operator that her daughter's stomach had burst. She begged for an ambulance, her voice tearing at the edges. She dropped the phone and hovered over the body, desperately trying to find a pulse, her shoes slipping in the thick blood that coated the linoleum. First responders were dispatched instantly. Local paramedics arrived within 4 minutes, rushing to what they believed was a severe medical anomaly. They burst through the front door, carrying heavy trauma bags and oxygen tanks. They took one step into the living room and froze. This was no medical emergency. The seasoned paramedics instantly recognized the dark, bruised ligature marks burned deep into the victim's neck. They saw the jagged, deliberate nature of the abdominal incisions. The cut was not a rupture, it was an extraction. They immediately backed away toward the door to preserve the scene, radioing for law enforcement backup with absolute urgency. Nottoway County Sheriff's deputies arrived moments later, securing the perimeter with crime scene tape. They walked through the house with their hands on their holsters, clearing the remaining rooms. They found the nursery. The crib stood empty. The baby clothes remained perfectly folded. The horrific reality crystallized for the investigators standing over the blood-soaked floor. The young mother had been strangled to death, and her unborn child had been carved directly from her womb. The infant was gone, the killer was gone, and the clock on the newborn's survival was ticking down fast. The Nottoway County Sheriff's Department faced an investigative nightmare. The crime scene inside the rural farmhouse was pristine in its horror, but entirely devoid of obvious forensic breadcrumbs. The attacker had vanished without leaving a murder weapon, a clear set of fingerprints, or an immediate direction of flight. The only certainty was the critical, rapidly closing window of survivability for the stolen infant. A newborn, violently removed under highly unsanitary conditions, faced catastrophic physiological risks: hypothermia, severe infection, and untreated hemorrhaging. Law enforcement immediately activated the Amber Alert System, a national protocol designed specifically for abducted children. But this particular activation was completely unprecedented in the history of American law enforcement. The alert network fundamentally required data: a photograph, a height, a weight, an outfit. Dispatchers sitting in the regional command center had absolutely nothing to input. They were forced to broadcast a bulletin for a child who had never been legally documented, never been photographed, and never taken a breath outside the womb. highway digital boards across Missouri, Kansas, and Iowa illuminated with a desperate, painfully vague plea. Authorities were searching for a red compact car, possibly a Honda or Toyota, and an unidentified female suspect carrying an unnamed newborn. While state troopers locked down the interstate corridors, a separate contingent of investigators drove to the local manufacturing plant, where the victim's husband was finishing his afternoon shift. He was pulled directly from the factory floor and escorted into a quiet administrative office. There, officers delivered the news that dismantled his entire reality. He was told his wife was dead and his unborn daughter had been surgically stolen. The husband collapsed under the sheer, incomprehensible weight of the information. As dictated by standard, unforgiving investigative procedure, detectives immediately vetted him as a potential suspect. They scrutinized his timeline, verified his electronic clock-in records, and extensively interviewed his coworkers. His alibi was ironclad. He had been operating heavy machinery miles away during the exact time frame of the slaughter. The grieving father was swiftly ruled out, leaving investigators staring back into a terrifying void. Back in Skidmore, the social echo of the crime triggered a localized panic. This was an isolated agricultural enclave of fewer than 300 residents. The conceptual barrier between the safety of a Midwestern farming community and the depravity of a metropolitan homicide was instantly shattered. Residents who had not turned a deadbolt in decades suddenly locked their doors, pulled their heavy blinds, and armed themselves. The psychological contagion was severe, radiating outward across the county line. Pregnant women in neighboring towns called local obstetric clinics in a state of sheer terror, canceling routine medical appointments and refusing to leave their homes. Rumors multiplied rapidly in the absence of hard facts. Theories circulated through the tight-knit community with terrifying momentum. Some speculated the attack was the work of a highly organized black market adoption ring operating out of a major city. Others whispered about fringe cult activity or a deranged drifter passing through the plains. The reality that a predator had calmly driven down their quiet streets in broad daylight, knocked on a front door, and executed a surgical theft felt entirely apocalyptic. The temperature plummeted as dusk settled over the state, dropping well below 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The biting cold added a brutal layer of urgency to the search efforts. By nightfall, the search grid had expanded massively. The FBI was brought in to assist the highway patrol. Helicopters equipped with forward-looking infrared cameras swept over the freezing, barren cornfields, searching for the heat signature of a dumped vehicle or a discarded infant. Canine units scoured the frosted ditches along the local routes. Troopers set up hard roadblocks, shining high-powered flashlights into the back seats and trunks of every vehicle exiting the rural perimeter. Inside the residence, crime scene technicians wearing sterile white Tyvek suits worked under harsh halogen lights. They mapped the blood spatter, bagged the severed neon pink rope, and dusted the door frames. Yet the physical search yielded absolutely nothing of immediate value. The red car was gone. The landscape had swallowed the perpetrator whole. Detectives standing in the blood-stained living room realized that traditional boots-on-the-ground police work was failing to generate a solid pursuit vector. The killer had left no physical trail leading away from the property. To find the missing baby, investigators needed to stop looking at the frozen dirt roads outside the house and start looking into the digital ether that had brought the monster directly to the front porch. The investigative focus shifted abruptly away from the floor and locked onto the glow of the personal computer sitting quietly in the corner of the room. The Nottoway County Sheriff's Department was fundamentally equipped to handle rural burglaries and localized domestic disputes, not a hyper-calculated fetal abduction. Realizing the physical landscape held no immediate answers, investigators cordoned off the blood-soaked living room and turned their attention to the victim's desktop computer. The beige plastic tower was carefully bagged and transported to a regional cyber crimes laboratory. The hardware itself was entirely unremarkable, but the hard drive contained the only viable map of the predator's movements. Forensic technicians cloned the drive to preserve the integrity of the data. In the sterile, temperature-controlled environment of the lab, a stark contrast to the slaughterhouse left behind in Skidmore, they began a tedious, systematic excavation of browser histories, cached files, and incoming email registries. Initially, the digital sweep yielded only mundane data. Analysts waded through online shopping receipts, utility payments, and emails from local relatives. The hours dragged heavily. The frustration within the command center mounted exponentially as detectives simultaneously chased physical dead ends on the ground. Troopers interviewed local delivery drivers, mail carriers, and known neighborhood eccentrics, generating zero actionable leads. Every passing minute statistically degraded the newborn's chances of survival. Detectives were hunting a ghost across a frozen county, while the answers sat locked behind a password-protected screen. The critical pivot occurred late into the night. Technicians scanning the internet cache isolated a series of communications tethered to the specialized breeding message board. They reconstructed the final weeks of the victim's digital life and uncovered the extensive, heavily documented correspondence with the user known as Darlene Fisher. The emails detailed the exact Thursday afternoon meeting time. It was a digital smoking gun. However, identifying a screen name was merely the first barrier. Investigators needed to pierce the veil of the alias. They immediately drafted emergency subpoenas for the forum administrators and the internet service provider hosting the specific email account. In 2004, acquiring ISP logs required navigating a dense labyrinth of federal warrants and corporate telecommunications bureaucracy. The delay was agonizing. Detectives paced the linoleum floors of the precinct, fueled by stale coffee and raw adrenaline, waiting for a server in another state to spit out a string of routing numbers. Just before dawn on December 17th, the ISP complied. The data packet arrived, and the email address belonging to the phantom buyer resolved to a specific IP address. It was a standard dial-up connection. Technicians traced the geographical origin of the node. The signal did not bounce around the dark web or hide behind complex encrypted proxies. It traced directly to a residential broadband account located in Melbourne, Kansas, an agricultural community situated roughly 150 miles south of the crime scene. The account was not registered to a Darlene Fisher. The billing information named a man, Kevin Montgomery. Because the abduction had crossed a state border, the FBI instantly assumed lead jurisdiction. Background checks were rapidly run on the Melbourne address. The homeowner lived there with his wife, 36-year-old Lisa Montgomery. When intelligence analysts pulled her profile, the bizarre architecture of the crime began to take a sickening, cohesive shape. Information gathered from local Kansas authorities painted a deeply disturbing picture of the household. Montgomery had been loudly and publicly claiming to be pregnant for several months. She had attended community events in maternity clothing, accepted gifts, and fully decorated a nursery in her home. Yet, medical records quickly obtained by federal agents revealed a biological impossibility. She had undergone a bilateral two-ball ligation in 1990. She was entirely incapable of conceiving a child. Further investigation exposed a looming, catastrophic crisis in her personal life. Her ex-husband had recently discovered her deception and was threatening to expose her fabricated pregnancy during an impending, highly contentious custody hearing over their biological children. He demanded medical proof of her condition. The psychological pressure cooker had reached its absolute breaking point. The walls of her reality were collapsing. She didn't just want a baby, she needed a physical infant to present to her community and the family courts to maintain her rapidly deteriorating web of lies. The transition from intelligence gathering to tactical deployment was immediate. A multi-agency task force, comprising FBI tactical units, Missouri State Highway Patrol, and Kansas Bureau of Investigation agents, converged on Osage County. A convoy of unmarked black SUVs tore down Interstate 35. The atmosphere inside the vehicles was suffocatingly tense. The agents knew exactly who they were hunting, but the physical condition of the stolen infant remained a terrifying unknown. Melbourne was a town even smaller than Skidmore, boasting a population of fewer than 400. The convoy exited the highway and navigated a grid of rural dirt roads, killing their headlights as they approached the target coordinates. The property sat isolated amid barren winter fields. The crunch of frost beneath the tires was the only sound. Parked squarely in the gravel driveway was a red Toyota Corolla, matching the exact description of the vehicle spotted idling in Missouri the previous afternoon. It was mid-afternoon on December 17th. Less than 24 hours had elapsed since the horrific extraction. heavily armed federal agents surrounded the perimeter of the Kansas farmhouse. They moved with absolute, silent precision. The metallic clack of rifles being readied echoed sharply in the frigid air. The tactical commander assessed the sightlines and gave the definitive signal. They breached the front door. The interior of the home was instantly flooded with tactical operators shouting commands. They moved rapidly through the narrow hallways, clearing rooms and securing the occupants. Kevin Montgomery was detained in the living room, entirely bewildered by the sudden militarized invasion of his residence. Agents stacked up and breached the master bedroom. Sitting on the edge of the mattress was Lisa Montgomery. She was casually watching television, and resting quietly in her arms, wrapped tightly in a soft blanket, was a newborn baby girl. The suspect did not panic. She did not attempt to flee, nor did she reach for a weapon. Instead, she stared blankly at the armored tactical team and calmly stated that the child was hers. She informed the agents that she had unexpectedly gone into labor the previous day and delivered the infant at a women's clinic in Topeka. The operators ignored her fabricated narrative. A tactical medic attached to the entry team immediately stepped forward and separated the infant from the suspect. The visual assessment of the child was nothing short of miraculous. Despite being violently carved from a dying woman's abdomen just hours prior, transported across state lines in a freezing compact car, and handled by a desperate predator, the baby was breathing steadily. The umbilical cord had been crudely severed and clamped, but she was alive. Montgomery was placed in heavy steel handcuffs and led out to a waiting federal vehicle. She walked silently past the red Toyota, its interior still containing microscopic traces of the unimaginable carnage she had left behind. The stolen infant, Victoria Joe, was secured in a specialized incubator and rushed by ambulance to a pediatric intensive care unit. The physical machinery of the abduction had been completely dismantled, leaving investigators to sift through the psychological wreckage of a woman who had crossed the ultimate moral boundary to sustain a delusion. The interrogation of the suspect unspooled a timeline of escalating, terrifying desperation. She had meticulously fabricated her condition for 9 months, completely deceiving her current husband and her entire community. The definitive catalyst for murder was a looming custody hearing with her former spouse. He had grown deeply suspicious of the situation and intended to demand official medical proof in front of a judge. If her lie was exposed, she faced the immediate loss of her existing children. The intense psychological pressure fractured her reality. She required a physical prop to sustain the deception, and she was willing to harvest it by any means necessary. Because the abduction crossed the Missouri-Kansas border, the case bypassed local jurisdictions, triggering a federal prosecution for kidnapping resulting in death. Defense attorneys heavily emphasized the suspect's history of severe mental illness and profound childhood trauma, arguing she suffered a complex psychotic break that rendered her incapable of understanding her actions. The prosecution dismantled that argument using the exhaustive forensic data harvested from her hard drive. The digital footprint, the weeks of patient grooming, the calculated selection of an isolated target, and the precise scheduling of the Thursday afternoon meeting demonstrated absolute cold-blooded premeditation. It was a surgical strike, not a spontaneous loss of sanity. The federal jury reviewed the digital timeline alongside the sheer physical brutality of the extraction. They systematically rejected the insanity defense. The perpetrator was convicted on all counts and handed a federal death sentence, a highly unusual judicial outcome for a female defendant in the modern legal era. On January 13, 2021, the federal government executed the convicted killer by lethal injection at a penitentiary in Indiana. The procedure closed the legal chapter of the case, but it offered no true equilibrium for the town of Skidmore. The Stinnett family remains forever altered by a crime of unfathomable theft. A stolen daughter was recovered and raised surrounded by family, yet an inescapable paradox defines her existence. Her birthday will always serve as the anniversary of her mother's brutal slaughter. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. Imagine writing a screenplay so meticulously detailed, it practically breathes. A 35-page document outlining the ultimate cinematic murder, the lure, the plastic-lined kill room, the disposal. Now imagine the director refusing to call cut. He steps out from behind the camera and turns his horror script into a real-time diary. In the fall of 2008, a rented garage became a slaughterhouse designed for the silver screen. The blood on the concrete wasn't stage makeup, and the victim wasn't an actor who could go home when filming wrapped. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. Mark Twitchell wanted to be a star. Living in Edmonton, Alberta, he presented himself as a visionary independent filmmaker on the verge of his big break. At 29, he had the outward trappings of a grounded adult life, a wife, a young daughter, a suburban home. But the reality behind the front door was hollow. Twitchell was bleeding money, funding his cinematic ambitions on maxed-out credit cards and borrowed time. He had recently directed a fan film set in a famous sci-fi universe, which garnered a small amount of local attention. But it wasn't enough. He craved visceral impact. He wanted to be recognized as a master of psychological terror. His obsession wasn't just with the camera. Twitchell was completely fixated on the hit television series Dexter, a show centered around a blood spatter analyst who moonlighted as a vigilante serial killer. He didn't just watch the episodes, he studied them. He analyzed the kill rooms, the plastic sheeting, the extreme emotional detachment of the protagonist. He began to mold his own identity around this fictional anti-hero. Twitchell even cast himself in a short thriller titled House of Cards, a script he wrote about a masked killer luring a cheating husband to a remote garage. The lines between his daily reality as a struggling father and the dark fantasies living inside his laptop were beginning to blur, merging into a dangerous compulsion for absolute control. Across town, a completely different kind of life was unfolding. John Brian Altinger, known to his friends as Johnny, was a 38-year-old man who appreciated simplicity. He was employed in the heavy manufacturing sector, specifically working with oil field equipment. It was demanding, blue-collar work. Johnny spent his days maneuvering steel machinery weighing thousands of pounds, earning a solid living through sweat and routine. He was reliable, deeply loyal to his circle, and passionately interested in motorcycles. He loved taking long rides on his bike, pushing 100 miles outside the city limits to clear his head after a grueling work week. Johnny was also single. The isolation of his demanding schedule had started to weigh heavily on him. He wanted a genuine connection. Like thousands of other working professionals navigating the modern dating landscape, he turned to the internet. He set up a profile on a popular dating website, hoping to find someone who shared his straightforward values. He wasn't looking for games or fleeting encounters. He wanted a partner to share his life with. These two men inhabited completely separate spheres within the sprawling Canadian landscape. One was grounded in the heavy physical reality of industrial labor, looking for honest companionship. The other was lost in a self-made labyrinth of cinematic violence and unearned grandiosity, desperate to bridge the gap between imagination and execution. Twitchell needed a set for his upcoming film projects. In September 2008, he signed a lease for a detached double-car garage in a quiet residential alleyway in the city's south side. It was a utilitarian space, bare walls, a concrete floor, completely isolated from the main street. He told the property owner he needed it to store equipment and shoot a few interior scenes. He immediately went to work transforming the space. He purchased heavy-duty plastic sheeting, industrial-strength tape, and a heavy metal table. He meticulously draped the walls in plastic, mirroring the exact aesthetic of his favorite television show. To his film crew, this was just set dressing, a dedicated director going the extra mile for authenticity. But Twitchell was no longer just preparing to film a movie. He was preparing a stage. Johnny Altinger spent his evenings scrolling through dating profiles in his modest condo. He sent polite messages, saving his money, maintaining a quiet and structured existence. He had absolutely no reason to suspect that his desire for a normal relationship was about to intersect with a man trying to write himself into a nightmare. The transition from a suburban father to a predator required infrastructure. The rented garage on 56th Street provided the physical space, But the digital space required an entirely different kind of architecture. Sitting in front of his laptop, the aspiring director began crafting his most important script yet, The Lure. He navigated to the dating platform Plenty of Fish and constructed a phantom. He created a profile for a woman named Sheena. Sheena was designed to be irresistible to a lonely man, attractive, adventurous, and slightly aggressive in her pursuit. The digital trap was set. Now, he needed to finalize the stage. Inside the detached garage, the temperature often hovered around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, trapping the heavy scent of damp concrete and industrial adhesive. The windows were completely blacked out. Thick layers of polyurethane plastic sheeting covered the walls, secured with endless strips of silver duct tape. A heavy metal table sat in the center of the floor, alongside a game processing kit containing various knives, a meat cleaver, and a handsaw. In his mind, the men he intended to lure were not breathing individuals with families and futures. They were simply blank slates, faceless white mannequins meant to be posed, used, and discarded for the sake of his ultimate production. He was no longer just an observer of fictional violence. He was the author. By the first week of October, the phantom named Sheena had successfully hooked a target. But it was not Johnny Altinger. The first man to walk into the trap was a 26-year-old named Gilles Tétriot. He had matched with Sheena online and exchanged a series of flirtatious messages. The instructions she provided for their first date were highly specific and undeniably strange. She directed him to avoid the front door of the house, instructing him instead to walk down a dark residential alley and enter through the side door of a detached garage. She claimed she was renting the space and wanted to surprise him. On the evening of October 3rd, Tétriot drove to the designated neighborhood. He parked his car a few blocks away and walked into the pitch-black alleyway. The air was biting, and the absolute silence of the suburban backstreet made his stomach twist. Every survival instinct screamed at him to turn around and walk back to his vehicle. But the social pressure of a first date, the fear of looking foolish or standing up a woman who had simply arranged a quirky meeting, pushed him forward. He reached the side door of the garage. It was unlocked. Tétriot pushed the heavy door open and stepped into absolute darkness. He called out, asking if anyone was there. A muffled voice from the pitch-black corner instructed him to step further inside. He took 2 more steps. Without warning, a figure lunged from the shadows. The attacker was clad in a black hockey mask, his eyes entirely hidden. A high-voltage stun baton cracked through the dark, a blinding arc of blue electricity, and struck Tétriot directly in the chest. The jolt paralyzed his muscles for a fraction of a second, sending him crashing onto the cold concrete floor. The attacker immediately dropped his weight onto the downed man, pressing a gloved hand over his mouth and pinning his limbs. This was the moment the script dictated that the victim would lose consciousness, allowing the director to begin his dark work. But reality refused to follow the screenplay. Tétriot was terrified, but the adrenaline flooding his system triggered an explosive fight-or-flight response. He realized instantly that this was not a mugging. This was a fight for his life. He thrashed wildly, bucking his hips and throwing violent, uncoordinated punches. The metal baton clattered across the concrete as the 2 men rolled over the plastic-lined floor. Tétriot managed to break the hold, scrambling on his hands and knees toward the large rolling garage door. He desperately grabbed the bottom handle and hoisted it upward, creating a gap of about 2 feet. He dove under the rising metal door, scraping his back against the track, gasping the freezing night air. But before he could get to his feet, 2 heavy hands wrapped around his ankles. The attacker dragged him backward, pulling him back into the plastic-lined nightmare. Tétriot kicked backwards with everything he had, his heavy boots connecting with flesh and bone. He broke free a second time, scrambled to his feet on the alley pavement, and braced for another attack. The masked figure emerged from beneath the garage door. But instead of continuing the assault, the attacker froze. The violent predator suddenly broke character. The man in the hockey mask held up his hands, his posture completely shifting, and explained that it was all just a joke, a misunderstanding meant for a movie. Tétriot didn't wait to hear the rest of the explanation. He turned and sprinted down the alley, his lungs burning until he reached the safety of his locked car. Ashamed, confused, and second-guessing what he had just survived, he chose not to contact the authorities that night. He convinced himself it really was a bizarre prank gone wrong. Back in the alley, the director closed the garage door. The first take had been a catastrophic failure. The stun baton was practically useless against a struggling 200-pound man. The physical realities of subduing a human being were far messier than they appeared on television. He didn't panic. He simply retreated to his laptop, opened his digital journal, and began writing notes on how to improve the trap. He noted that the baton was insufficient. He realized he needed a heavier, blunt instrument for the initial strike. He refined the script, adjusted the lighting, and reset the stage. The trap was empty, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. Exactly 1 week later, the Phantom profile activated again. On October 10th, the digital trap was baited and cast back into the dating pool. It did not take long for the algorithm to connect the fake persona with a man actively seeking a genuine relationship. Johnny received the exact same set of instructions that had been sent out 7 days prior. The messages from the woman were highly specific. Skip the front door of the house, park on the adjacent street, walk down the unlit alleyway, and enter the rented garage through the side access. The setup was undeniably odd. Johnny was a practical, grounded man who dealt in the heavy reality of steel and oilfield mechanics, and this covert meeting sounded more like an adolescent prank than a Friday night date. Still, the prospect of a connection pushed his skepticism aside. Before leaving his condo, he made a single, pragmatic decision. He opened his email, drafted a quick message to a close friend, and pasted the exact driving directions the woman had provided. He noted that he was heading to this specific address for a date, essentially leaving a digital breadcrumb trail just in case the situation turned out to be a scam. That mundane action, the simple click of the send button, was the only reason he did not disappear without a trace. The temperature outside had dropped into the upper 30s as the sun set over the suburbs. Johnny climbed into his red Mazda and drove toward the south side of the city. He navigated the quiet residential grid, eventually pulling over on 56th Street just as the instructions demanded. He turned off the engine. He stepped out into the crisp autumn air, zipping up his jacket against the biting chill. He walked toward the alley. There were no street lamps illuminating the narrow corridor between the fences and the detached garages. The crunch of gravel under his heavy boots was the only sound. He found the specific side door. He reached out and turned the handle. It was unlocked. Johnny pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air in the garage was stagnant, heavy with the sharp chemical odor of polyurethane plastic and industrial adhesive. It was completely dark. He called out, asking if anyone was there. From the pitch-black corner, a voice told him to step further in. He took another step. The director lunged. There was no high-voltage stun baton this time. The script had been revised. The weapon of choice was a heavy steel pipe. The attacker swung the metal bar with maximum force. It connected solidly. The sickening crack of steel against bone echoed in the confined space. The impact dropped the heavy-set mechanic instantly. Johnny crashed onto the concrete floor, completely disoriented, his vision exploding into white flashes. But the blue-collar worker was incredibly strong. The initial shock wore off in a fraction of a second, replaced by pure, adrenaline-fueled survival instinct. He fought back. The struggle was violent, messy, and entirely devoid of cinematic grace. They rolled across the floor. Heavy boots kicked against the walls, tearing the plastic sheeting. The metal preparation table screeched across the concrete. Johnny threw desperate punches, trying to push the masked weight off his chest, gasping for air in the freezing, dark room. He scrambled, trying to find leverage, trying to reach the door. The attacker realized he was losing physical control. He dropped the steel pipe. He pulled a heavy hunting knife. The fight ended in a frantic, brutal sequence. The knife pierced flesh again and again. The frantic thrashing slowed. The heavy breathing turned into a wet, ragged gasp, and then absolute silence. The director stood up in the dark. He was panting, his muscles burning from the exertion. He looked down at the floor. The victim was dead. There was no panic. There was no overwhelming wave of remorse or shock. Instead, the man in the mask felt a profound, chilling sense of validation. He had successfully transitioned the violence from his imagination into the physical world. He walked over to his laptop, which was sitting on a workbench, booted it up, and immediately began typing a detailed account of what he had just experienced. He documented the feeling of the struggle, the resistance of the victim, and the ultimate thrill of taking a life. He treated the murder like a successful dress rehearsal. Then the labor began. The reality of dealing with a deceased human being weighing nearly 200 pounds is a logistical nightmare. It requires hours of exhausting, methodical work. The killer pulled the game processing kit onto the metal table. He stripped off his outer layers and began the gruesome process of dismemberment. It was not clean, it was not fast. The hand saw required immense physical effort to cut through heavy bone and joint. The smell of copper filled the enclosed space, thick and suffocating. The sheer volume of fluids overwhelmed the hastily constructed kill room. Despite the meticulous layers of duct tape and plastic sheeting draped across the walls and floor, the barrier was not perfect. Deep crimson fluid pooled at the edges of the room, found microscopic gaps in the adhesive tape, and seeped directly into the porous concrete underneath. The killer worked relentlessly through the night. He separated the remains, packing them tightly into heavy-duty industrial trash bags. He wiped down the metal table, sprayed chemical cleaners over the plastic walls, and attempted to scrub the worst of the mess from the floor. He gathered the victim's personal effects, his wallet, his keys, his phone. He wasn't just disposing of a body, he was planning to steal an identity. In the early hours of the morning, long before the suburban neighborhood woke up, the killer secured the heavy black bags. He locked the side door of the garage, leaving the faint smell of bleach and copper trapped inside. He walked out to the street, located the red Mazda parked right where the victim had left it, and used the stolen keys to unlock the door. He slid into the driver's seat. He started the engine and drove the victim's car away from the scene, blending seamlessly into the morning traffic. The physical body had been erased from the map. Now, the director needed to erase the man's digital footprint, setting the stage for the final act of his horrific production. The weekend passed with an unsettling quiet. By Monday morning, the heavy machinery operator did not show up for his scheduled shift at the manufacturing plant. This was a glaring anomaly. He was the kind of employee who arrived early, methodically checked his equipment, and never missed a day without a formal phone call. When his supervisor checked the company inbox, there was a message waiting, but it wasn't a standard sick leave notification. The email claimed that the sender had met an extraordinary woman over the weekend. It stated that he was resigning from his position immediately, packing his bags, and boarding a plane to Costa Rica for an extended romantic getaway. Similar messages landed in the inboxes of his closest friends. The digital ventriloquism was clumsy. The killer was attempting to write a script for a dead man, but he failed to understand the character he was playing. The people reading these messages stared at their screens in absolute disbelief. The vocabulary was entirely wrong. The emails were filled with flowery adjectives, melodramatic phrasing, and breathless enthusiasm. It sounded like poorly written movie dialogue, not the pragmatic, straightforward communication of a blue-collar worker. Furthermore, the narrative itself was utterly implausible. The man they knew was fiercely dedicated to his routines. He loved his motorcycle, his friends, and the financial stability his grueling job provided. He was not the type of person to abandon his entire life on a whim for a stranger he met on the internet. He was cautious. He was planning for the future. The psychological horror of realizing that a stranger's fingers were typing on his keyboard, pretending to be him, sent a shockwave of dread through his inner circle. The anxiety rapidly metastasized into genuine panic. They tried calling his cell phone repeatedly, but the calls went straight to a generic voicemail. Text messages remained unread. By Tuesday, a small group of his friends decided they could no longer wait for a response. They drove to his condominium complex, their stomachs nodding with every passing mile as the cold October wind rattled the bare trees. The building superintendent, sensing their mounting distress, agreed to let them inside the unit. The apartment was completely silent. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of old coffee and undisturbed dust. Everything was exactly as it should be for a man who had simply stepped out for the evening. Dishes sat in the drying rack. His heavy winter boots were missing, but his everyday sneakers were lined up by the door. His mail was stacked neatly on the kitchen counter. They moved into the bedroom and began searching through his personal files. Within minutes, they found the absolute confirmation that their friend had not boarded a flight to Central America. Sitting inside a secure drawer, untouched and left behind, was his passport. You cannot fly to Costa Rica without a passport. The tropical romance was a poorly fabricated lie. The friends immediately drove to the local police precinct to file a missing persons report. Initially, they met the standard bureaucratic friction. Law enforcement agencies deal with runaway adults every single day, and the initial assumption is almost always that the individual chose to disappear to clear their head. The patrol officers noted that the missing man was in his late 30s, legally autonomous, and completely capable of leaving the country if he wished. But the friends refused to be dismissed. They laid out the glaring inconsistencies, the completely out-of-character emails, the abandoned travel documents, the sudden, unceremonious resignation from a lucrative career. Then, they produced the smoking gun. They handed the desk sergeant a printed copy of the email the victim had sent just hours before he vanished. It contained the highly specific driving directions to a residential alleyway on 56th Street. The police realized they were no longer dealing with a voluntary disappearance. The atmosphere in the precinct shifted instantly from routine paperwork to active, high-alert urgency. As patrol units were briefed, a heavy, unspoken fear began to ripple through the city's manufacturing community. Rumors spread rapidly across the shop floors and break rooms. A dependable, well-liked mechanic had vanished without a trace after logging onto a dating site. The social echo was chilling. Single men in the area who used the same online platforms suddenly found themselves scrutinizing their matches, wondering if the women they were messaging were actually predators operating behind fake avatars. The digital landscape, usually a space for connection and vulnerability, suddenly felt like an active hunting ground. Trust evaporated. Detectives immediately focused their resources on the digital breadcrumb trail. They ran the IP addresses associated with the bizarre getaway emails. They contacted the dating platform to pull the internal records for the phantom profile that had lured the victim into the dark. And most importantly, they targeted the physical address provided in that final life-saving message. The driving directions did not lead to a sprawling suburban house or an apartment building. They led down a dark, narrow corridor of cracked pavement lined with utility poles and refuse bins. They led directly to a detached, double-car garage. Investigators dispatched an unmarked unit to the South Side neighborhood. They needed to secure the perimeter, run the license plates of any vehicles in the vicinity, and figure out exactly who was renting the structure. The case was about to pivot violently from a standard missing person inquiry into a full-scale forensic excavation. The fabricated script was unraveling at the seams, and the director was about to be pulled out from behind the camera. The transition from a missing persons inquiry to a homicide investigation hinged entirely on the physical coordinates provided in that final life-saving email. Detectives descended on the quiet residential alleyway and located the specific structure. After securing a search warrant and cutting a heavy steel padlock, investigators raised the rolling metal door. The interior was completely silent and entirely devoid of vehicles, but the atmosphere was immediately oppressive. The air was thick with the suffocating fumes of industrial bleach and heavy-duty degreasers, a chemical assault attempting to mask a faint, underlying metallic odor. The walls were still partially draped in thick plastic sheeting. To the naked eye, the concrete floor looked clean, save for a few dark stains near the center drain, but human blood is notoriously resilient. When crime scene technicians darkened the garage and applied specialized chemical reagents, the floor illuminated in a brilliant, terrifying blue luminescence. The reaction revealed broad, sweeping drag marks, massive pooling areas, and high-velocity spatter patterns cast against the plastic-lined walls. A catastrophic amount of bloodletting had occurred in this tight space, far more than could be explained away by a simple accident. The property owner quickly provided the name on the lease agreement. The space was rented to an aspiring local filmmaker. Investigators located the suspect and brought him into the precinct for an initial interview. This is typically the moment a guilty individual shows stress fractures, sweating, defensive posturing, a demand for legal counsel, but the director did not break a sweat. He sat in the interrogation room with an air of mild amusement, completely relaxed, practically eager to answer questions. He listened to the detectives outline the horrific findings in his rented garage. Without missing a beat, he launched into a meticulously rehearsed narrative. He explained that he was an independent director currently shooting a dark psychological thriller. The plot of his short film involved a masked killer luring a man into a plastic-lined garage. The horrific scene the police had discovered, he insisted, was simply his movie set. He claimed the blood on the floor was an expensive theatrical prop, a specialized synthetic mixture purchased online to look incredibly realistic on camera. He even offered to show them the prop weapons used during the shoot. It was a brilliantly constructed red herring. The defense was entirely logical within the context of his known profession. The detectives found themselves staring at a massive hurdle. They had a garage full of fluid that might just be stage blood, a suspect with a documented history of directing violent indie films, and absolutely no physical body to prove a crime had actually taken place. The investigation stalled, trapped in a frustrating limbo between fiction and reality. The suspect walked out of the police station, having successfully played the role of an eccentric, misunderstood artist. But a script relies on continuity, and the director had left a massive plot hole sitting in plain sight. While the forensic teams awaited lab results on the fluid samples, a patrol unit canvassed the neighborhoods surrounding the suspect's residence. They found a red Mazda parked conspicuously in the driveway of an acquaintance. When questioned, the homeowner explained that the filmmaker had asked to store the car there, claiming he had purchased it for a friend. A quick check of the vehicle identification number shattered the movie set alibi. The car belonged to the missing oil field worker. Detectives immediately executed a high-risk search warrant at the suspect's suburban home. They bypassed the standard physical evidence and went straight for the nerve center of his operation, his electronics. A heavy encrypted laptop was seized from his home office and handed directly to the Cyber Crimes Division. The suspect had been confident. He had formatted his hard drive and deleted his digital journal, assuming that moving files to the digital trash bin permanently erased them from existence. But digital forensics is an exact science. Data is rarely destroyed. It is simply unindexed, waiting in the dark sectors of a hard drive for someone to dig it out. After hours of meticulous reconstruction, a cyber analyst recovered a 35-page Microsoft Word document. It was titled simply, SK Confessions. The detectives crowded around the monitor, reading the recovered text in absolute silence. It was not a screenplay. It was not a treatment for an upcoming thriller. It was a step-by-step first-person diary of a descent into madness. The prose was a masterclass in extreme narcissism. The author chronicled his lifelong fascination with violence and his conscious decision to transition from a suburban father to an apex predator. He wrote extensively about his admiration for fictional serial killers, analyzing their methods and noting how he planned to improve upon them in the real world. The document detailed the construction of the kill room on 56th Street. It documented the creation of the phantom dating profile. Then, it provided an excruciatingly detailed account of the first failed attempt. The author complained about the physical resilience of the first victim, expressing frustration that the stun baton failed to incapacitate a 200-pound man. He wrote about the target crawling under the garage door and escaping into the alley, forcing him to rethink his choice of weaponry. The narrative then shifted to October 10th. The pacing of the writing accelerated. The author described the arrival of the second man, the heavy machinery operator who walked into the trap. The document detailed the ambush with a heavy steel pipe, the desperate, violent struggle on the concrete floor, and the final fatal strikes with a hunting knife. The author noted the exact sound of the victim's final exhalation. The horrific diary did not stop at the murder. It laid out the exhausting logistics of the aftermath. The text described the grueling physical labor of dismemberment using a handsaw, noting the overwhelming smell and the sheer volume of effort required to reduce a human being into manageable pieces. Finally, the author detailed loading the heavy black bags into his vehicle, driving to a specific suburban alleyway, and dropping the remains deep into the city's underground storm sewer system. The recovered file was the ultimate undoing of the scripted killer. He had successfully erased the physical evidence, manipulated his friends, and lied his way through a police interrogation. But his ego demanded an audience. He could not resist documenting his masterpiece. In his desperate need to feel like a visionary, he had provided law enforcement with a complete signed confession detailing exactly how, where, and why he destroyed a human life. The missing persons case was officially closed. A homicide manhunt had begun. The trial commenced in the spring of 2011, transforming an Edmonton courtroom into the final act of a deeply disturbing production. The defense strategy relied on a desperate pivot. The filmmaker took the stand and admitted to the physical act of ending the victim's life, but he insisted the entire scenario was meant to be a harmless prank, an immersive entertainment experience that spiraled out of control. He claimed the heavy machinery operator became unreasonably aggressive during the encounter, forcing a lethal struggle in sheer self-defense. It was a fabricated narrative, entirely dismantled by his own ego. Prosecutors simply presented the recovered digital diary. The 35-page document systematically destroyed the self-defense argument. The text highlighted the meticulous premeditation, the advanced purchase of the game processing kit, and the previous failed ambush involving the high-voltage baton. The prosecution noted that no one prepares a heavy metal table and poly-wrapped walls for a practical joke. The document was an undeniable step-by-step blueprint for a calculated thrill kill. The jury required very little time to see through the cinematic facade. On April 12, 2011, they returned a swift and unanimous verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence carried a mandatory life term in a federal penitentiary, permanently stripping the director of his audience, his cameras, and his freedom for a minimum of 25 years. Mark Twitchell wanted to leave a legacy in the world of cinema. He succeeded, but not as a visionary director. He is remembered only as a man who allowed his vanity to completely eclipse his humanity. A predator who built a slaughterhouse just to play the lead role. The terror of this case lies in the cold, calculated choice to erase the boundary between a screenplay and a breathing man. He treated a brutal execution as an artistic exercise and traded 2 lives for a story no one ever wanted to see. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. Inside a standard, dust-covered cardboard box in a suburban Utah garage, wrapped in old towels and sealed with heavy packing tape, lay a secret that defied human biology and maternal instinct. For 10 years, a mother managed to give birth to 7 healthy infants in total isolation, only to systematically end their lives the moment they drew their first breath. She didn't flee, she didn't hide the evidence across state lines, and she didn't change her identity. Instead, she placed the remains into separate storage containers and lived just a few feet away from them, continuing her daily routine as if the garage held nothing more than forgotten holiday decorations. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand how a domestic garage in a quiet Utah suburb became a multi-year burial ground, one must examine the specific social geography of Pleasant Grove and the fractured reality of the woman at the center of the horror. Nestled against the rugged slopes of the Wasatch Range, Pleasant Grove was a community deeply rooted in traditional family structures, religious cohesion, and an outward expectation of wholesome domesticity. In this environment, hyper-vigilant neighbors kept immaculate lawns, church attendance was a social baseline, and large families were celebrated. It was the last place anyone would look for a systemic anomaly. Yet the insular nature of the community simultaneously created a perfect screen for extreme isolation. Megan Huntsman lived in a modest home owned by her parents on East 200 South, a property that looked entirely indistinguishable from the neighboring residences, complete with a cluttered but ostensibly normal driveway and garage. Born in 1975, Huntsman grew up within this culture, but gradually drifted into its deepest, darkest margins. Those who interacted with her during her 20s and early 30s described a woman who was physically present but emotionally vacant. A quiet, almost ghost-like figure who mastered the art of being unmemorable. She was small in stature, frequently wearing oversized, loose-fitting clothing that became a permanent fixture of her wardrobe. To the outside world, she was a mother raising 3 daughters. She walked them to the local park, attended occasional neighborhood gatherings, and took on sporadic, low-wage jobs, including working at a local manufacturing plant and babysitting for families in the area. Neighbors noted that she was exceptionally quiet, rarely initiating conversation, but she was never viewed as a threat. She was trusted with other people's children, maintaining a fragile veneer of baseline competence that kept the state's Division of Child and Family Services completely away from her door. Behind this mundane facade lay a severe, rapidly escalating addiction that consumed every financial resource and cognitive function Huntsman possessed. By the late 1990s, she had become heavily dependent on methamphetamine. The drug took absolute priority over her reality, warping her judgment and hollowing out her emotional capacity. In a community where substance abuse was heavily stigmatized and viewed as a moral failure, her addiction had to remain completely subterranean. Huntsman became a master of compartmentalization, occupying 2 distinct universes simultaneously. In one, she was the muted, dependable mother navigating the suburban landscape of Pleasant Grove. In the other, she was a severe addict, operating in a state of perpetual chemical survival, driven by a profound panic that her secret life would be exposed, stripping away her housing, her children, and her remaining social standing. Her long-term partner and husband, Darren West, shared this turbulent subculture of addiction, but lacked her ability to remain under the radar. The domestic environment on East 200 South was volatile, defined by erratic financial strain, constant substance use, and a complete breakdown of healthy communication. Yet despite the chaos of their shared drug use, a profound emotional chasm existed between the two. They operated as parallel entities under the same roof, bound by habit and shared vices rather than genuine intimacy. While West's legal troubles began to mount, drawing the attention of federal law enforcement due to his involvement in meth distribution networks, Huntsman managed to fade further into the background. She learned to minimize her footprint, ensuring that even as her home life deteriorated into a haze of chemical dependency and paranoia, the external perception of her household remained just orderly enough to avoid official intervention. This deliberate cultivation of obscurity allowed an unfathomable routine to establish itself within the home, completely unnoticed by her growing daughters, her extended family, and the neighbors who lived just feet away. The relationship between Megan Huntsman and Darren West was forged in the early 1990s within the specific insular geography of Utah County, a region where rapid suburban sprawl intersected with a hidden underground drug subculture. To outward appearances, the couple represented a standard blue-collar pairing typical of the area. They had met during their late teens, a period when both were drifting away from the strict religious and social expectations of their upbringing. West was known in his immediate circle as an assertive, somewhat reckless individual who frequently sought out high-risk environments, while Huntsman was remembered as a highly malleable, quiet figure who easily dissolved into the background of whoever she was with. By the mid-1990s, they had established a permanent domestic partnership, eventually marrying and moving into the home on East 200 South in Pleasant Grove. To family members, they seemed committed to building a life together, welcoming 3 daughters into the world over the next decade. These children grew up in a household that appeared, from the street, to be entirely stable. Beneath that veneer, the structural foundation of their partnership was completely hollowed out by a shared dependency on illicit substances, specifically methamphetamine. The drug served as both the primary bond between them and the architect of their profound isolation. As the years progressed, their daily lives became entirely transactional, dictated by the logistical demands of maintaining a constant chemical supply. West shifted from a mere consumer of the drug into an active participant in local distribution networks, a choice that introduced an undercurrent of paranoia and volatility into the residence. Yet the most critical dynamic of their relationship was not the shared criminality, but the total breakdown of genuine interpersonal awareness. They existed as domestic ghosts under the same roof. West was frequently absent, consumed by his illicit business ventures and late-night associations, while Huntsman withdrew deeper into a state of perpetual intoxication. Her severe addiction created a highly specific form of psychological detachment. She became entirely non-communicative, executing her daily tasks as a mother with a mechanical, detached precision that left no room for emotional intimacy. This total absence of mutual observation explains how the core paradox of this household was allowed to manifest. Between 1996 and 2006, a period of exactly 10 years, the structural arrangement of their relationship enabled Huntsman to conceal an unimaginable secret. During these years, she became pregnant multiple times. Because her baseline physical appearance was small and she consistently favored heavily layered, baggy winter clothing, the physical transformations of these pregnancies remained entirely unremarked upon by West. In his later statements to investigators, he insisted that he never once suspected his wife was carrying his children during those specific intervals. This was not merely a failure of physical perception, but a testament to the profound emotional and psychological chasm that defined their marriage. The heavy cloud of methamphetamine use created a persistent state of cognitive fog and self-absorption for both parties. West was too focused on his own legal jeopardy and drug transactions to notice the subtle changes in his wife's body or behavior, while Huntsman operated with a calculated, silent determination to ensure that her pregnancies never disrupted the fragile domestic status quo that kept her addiction funded and hidden. The domestic environment during this decade became a masterclass in sinister camouflage. The couple managed to raise their 3 living daughters to school age, ensuring they were clothed, fed, and integrated into the local community. Relatives frequently visited the home, cooking meals in the kitchen and walking through the living areas without ever detecting a hint of the systemic darkness unfolding in the parallel reality Huntsman had constructed. West's presence in the home became increasingly sporadic as law enforcement began closing in on his distribution operations, a development that only intensified Huntsman's isolation. She was left entirely alone with her thoughts and her chemical dependency, viewing any potential addition to the family not as a human life, but as an existential threat to her survival mechanism. A new infant would mean mandatory medical intervention, visits from social workers, financial strain that would siphon money away from her drug supply, and the immediate exposure of her severe addiction to a community that would instantly cast her out. To prevent this collapse, she utilized the profound neglect within her relationship as a protective shield. She knew with absolute certainty that as long as she remained quiet, uncomplaining, and invisible, her husband would never look closely enough to see what was happening right in front of him. This mutual detachment became the ultimate enabling factor, setting the stage for a localized sequence of events that occurred entirely within the physical confines of a shared family home, completely unrecorded by the man who slept in the very same bed. The culmination of Megan Huntsman's secret timeline did not occur in a single explosive confrontation, but rather unfolds across a highly specific, repetitive sequence of physical actions that transpired between 1996 and 2006. The true incident in this case is not a solitary date. It is a decade-long clinical methodology executed entirely within the walls of the home on East 200 South. Each localized event followed an almost identical operational loop. Huntsman would go into labor completely unassisted, typically in the late night or early morning hours, while the rest of the household was asleep or absent. She did not call for medical assistance, nor did she utilize any standard prenatal resources. The births occurred on the floor of her bathroom or bedroom in absolute silence. The physical mechanics of these moments required a terrifying level of self-control and detachment. To prevent any sound from escaping the room and alerting her daughters or neighbors, Huntsman relied on the heavy, chemical-induced sedation of her methamphetamine use. The drug did not just fuel her paranoia, it provided a visceral numbing effect, allowing her to endure the intense physical trauma of childbirth without making an audible sound. The moment each infant emerged into the world, alive and breathing, Huntsman did not hesitate. There was no period of maternal contemplation, no shifting of intent. The process was immediate, mechanical, and entirely transactional. According to her subsequent admissions, she would immediately apply pressure to the infant's airway, using her bare hands or a piece of cloth to stop the breathing before the child could produce a first cry. In at least one instance, a small cord or strip of fabric was wrapped tightly around the neck to ensure asphyxiation. The sensory environment of these moments was defined by an immediate shift from the warmth of birth to the cold reality of concealment. Once the infant ceased to move, Huntsman did not panic or attempt to destroy the evidence. Her primary objective was preservation through total containment. She would immediately wrap the small body in whatever materials were readily available within the immediate domestic space: old bath towels, discarded t-shirts, sheets of plastic, or layers of heavy utility paper. She would then place the bundle inside a standard cardboard shoebox or a small shipping container. To prevent any biological decomposition from creating an odor that would compromise the household, she sealed every edge of the cardboard with multiple layers of heavy-duty packing tape, creating an airtight vacuum. The final step of the sequence involved moving the sealed box from the living space into the attached garage. The garage was not a remote storage locker. It was an active part of the daily family routine. It was cluttered with the standard artifacts of suburban life: broken lawnmowers, old holiday decorations, storage bins, and tools. Huntsman would navigate this space, placing the newly sealed box onto a shelf or packing it deep into a corner behind larger items, ensuring it blended completely into the surrounding clutter. She would then return to the house, clean the birth site with standard household detergents, and resume her role as a mother, preparing breakfast for her living children or walking them to school just hours later. This precise process was repeated 6 more times over the course of 10 years. The intervals between the births were marked by an absolute lack of intervention, because the garage remained cold during the Utah winters and dry during the summers. The sealed boxes functioned as primitive mummification chambers. The heavy layers of tape and plastic successfully contained the chemical byproducts of decay, preventing any noticeable scent from penetrating the shared walls of the residence. The living daughters played in the driveway, walked past the shelves to grab bicycles, and spent their childhoods inches away from a growing collection of sealed cardboard boxes, completely unaware that their mother had cataloged the remains of their siblings behind old paint cans and seasonal clothing bins. The final element of this prolonged timeline occurred in April 2014, when the physical reality of the garage was finally forced into the light. Darren West had been released from a federal correctional institution after serving a multi-year sentence for drug offenses. The relationship between the two had completely dissolved during his incarceration, and Huntsman had recently vacated the property, leaving behind decades of accumulated domestic refuse. West, along with several extended family members, arrived at the house with the sole intention of cleaning out the garage so the property could be prepared for sale or re-rental. The physical atmosphere on that spring morning was heavy with dust and the scent of stagnant air. West began moving large items from the shelves, working his way toward the back corners of the space. It was during this process that he encountered a specific cardboard box that felt unusually heavy and was wrapped in an excessive amount of degraded packing tape. Using a utility knife, he sliced through the old adhesive and pulled back the cardboard flaps. Inside, beneath a layer of stained towels, he discovered a tightly wrapped plastic bundle. The sensory anchor of this discovery was the immediate release of a sharp chemical odor that had been trapped for years. West cut into the inner plastic layer, expecting to find old car parts or discarded chemicals. Instead, he exposed a tiny, completely preserved human foot. The shock was instantaneous and physical. West dropped the box, retreated from the garage into the driveway, and immediately called the Pleasant Grove Police Department. The dispatcher received a call from a man who could barely articulate what he was looking at, repeating only that he had found something dead, wrapped in plastic inside his garage. When the first patrol officers arrived at East 200 South, they found West sitting on the curb, visibly shaken. The officers entered the garage with flashlights, expecting to find an abandoned animal or a medical specimen left behind by a previous tenant. They approached the opened box on the floor. As the beam of the flashlight illuminated the interior of the plastic wrapping, the responding officer confirmed the presence of an infant corpse. The scene was immediately frozen. The property was cordoned off with yellow crime scene tape, and a call was placed to the Major Crimes Unit and the state medical examiner. The quiet suburban street was suddenly flooded with emergency vehicles, marking the end of the silent decade and the beginning of a forensic investigation that would completely shatter the community's perception of the house on East 200 South. The discovery of the first infant body instantly converted the suburban home from a chaotic storage clearing site into a restricted forensic grid. Within 30 minutes of the initial emergency call, the driveway on East 200 South was blocked by 4 patrol units, their strobe lights throwing rhythmic blue and red reflections against the aluminum garage door. The responding patrolmen, recognizing the profound biological anomaly inside the open cardboard box, did not attempt to alter or unpack the contents. They immediately withdrew, establishing a strict perimeter with yellow barrier tape that sealed off the entire front yard, the driveway, and the side alleys leading to the back of the property. The atmosphere in the immediate vicinity transformed. The casual weekend sounds of lawnmowers and neighborhood children were replaced by the heavy idling of unmarked police cruisers and the arrival of the Utah County Major Crimes Unit. By mid-afternoon, the state medical examiner's team arrived alongside a digital forensics unit and specialized technical investigators. The physical objective was clear but intensely meticulous. Every square inch of the garage had to be systematically cataloged, photographed, and cleared. The structure itself was a deep, disorganized space filled with decades of accumulated domestic debris, stacked plastic storage bins, discarded car parts, loose tools, old clothing, and seasonal decorations. Because the first body had been found inside a standard cardboard box hidden behind unrelated household refuse, the search team could not rely on visual inspection alone. Every object had to be moved, scanned, and cataloged. As investigators began the slow process of clearing the shelves, the operational focus shifted from a localized discovery to the identification of an intentional hidden system. Within hours, a second heavily taped cardboard box was located on an upper shelf, buried behind old paint cans. Then, a third. By the time the sun began to set over the Wasatch Range, forensic technicians had identified a total of 7 separate cardboard boxes that shared identical packaging characteristics. Each container was wrapped in multiple, degraded layers of heavy packing tape, electrical adhesive, or plastic wrap, designed to seal the biological contents from the outside environment. The physical retrieval of these boxes was executed with clinical precision. Technicians wearing full biohazard suits and double-layered nitrile gloves carefully lifted each sealed container from its resting place, transferring them directly to rigid, temperature-controlled evidence transport bins. The ambient air inside the garage remained thick with dust and the lingering synthetic scent of old automotive chemicals. But as each box was moved, the structural integrity of the seal was preserved to protect any latent trace evidence. Investigators noted that the containers had been placed in completely unexceptional locations. Some sat on open wire shelving alongside standard utility tools, while others were wedged into the dark spaces between old furniture and stacks of magazines. There was no specialized hidden compartment or locked vault. The collection was integrated entirely into the mundane topography of household junk. While the physical clearing of the garage was underway, a parallel tracking operation was launched to locate the former resident of the home. Megan Huntsman had left the property several months prior and was currently residing at a temporary location in a neighboring municipality. Her sudden departure, combined with the extreme nature of the evidence discovered in her family's garage, made her the primary person of interest. Detectives from the Pleasant Grove Police Department did not issue a public alert or utilize broadcast media for a widespread search, fearing that a high-profile pursuit might cause the suspect to flee or destroy additional evidence. Instead, they utilized silent electronic surveillance, tracking her known cellular footprint and monitoring the addresses of her immediate associates. The local social echo began to manifest long before the official police press conference. In a tight-knit community where neighbors shared property lines for decades, the sight of a full forensic extraction team operating under floodlights in the middle of a residential block triggered immediate, volatile rumors. Small groups of residents gathered at the edge of the police tape, watching technicians carry the uniform evidence bins from the garage to the state transport vans. The primary confusion centered on how an entire family, including 3 growing daughters and an extended network of relatives who frequently visited the home, could have coexisted with such a reality without a single drop of information leaking to the outside world. Rumors circulating through local phone trees suggested everything from a mass casualty event to a clandestine medical waste disposal site. The absolute silence from the police department during the first 12 hours of the operation only intensified the community's profound anxiety. Inside the secure environment of the Utah County Medical Examiner's facility, the forensic process entered its most difficult phase. The 7 sealed containers were placed inside a sterile isolation theater equipped with advanced ventilation systems to handle biological decomposition. One by one, forensic pathologists began the delicate process of slicing through the decades-old packing tape and plastic layers. Each incision had to be made with extreme care to avoid damaging the fragile skeletal and tissue structures inside. As the layers of cardboard and adhesive were peeled back, the internal contents revealed a consistent, horrifying pattern of preservation. Inside 6 of the boxes, pathologists uncovered the mummified, fragile remains of an infant. The dry, stable climate of the garage had slowed the standard process of decay, leaving skin textures, tiny bone structures, and hair patterns partially intact beneath the wrapped towels and utility paper. However, when the 7th box was opened, the biological findings differed significantly. The remains within this specific container showed clear signs of a full-term stillbirth, with medical indicators suggesting the infant had died in utero due to natural complications before any external intervention could occur. This critical distinction meant that while 7 bodies had been systematically packaged and concealed, the legal boundaries of the homicide investigation would focus strictly on the 6 infants who had entered the world alive. The conclusion of the initial search on East 200 South left the property completely hollowed out, its mundane garage converted into a permanently stigmatized landmark. The physical evidence was safely secured within state laboratories, and the electronic surveillance net was closing in on Huntsman's temporary residence. The investigation was about to transition from the silent containment of a crime scene to a direct psychological confrontation, as detectives prepared to bring the quiet mother out of the margins and into the interrogation room to answer the fundamental question of how a decade of human life could be reduced to a collection of sealed cardboard boxes. The physical containment of the house on East 200 South shifted the structural burden of the case entirely onto the interview rooms of the Pleasant Grove Police Department. Megan Huntsman was located at a nearby residence and brought into custody without physical resistance. The environment of the interrogation space was clinically sterile, a small, windowless room defined by a metal table, 2 recording devices, and the steady, low hum of the building's ventilation system. For the lead detectives, the primary tactical challenge was navigating the profound emotional flatlining of the woman sitting across from them. Huntsman did not exhibit the erratic, high-energy behavior typical of acute methamphetamine intoxication, nor did she display the visible panic of a suspect facing multiple counts of first-degree murder. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap, her responses delivered in a flat, uninflected monotone that completely detached the linguistic reality of her words from the biological horror of the evidence. The initial phase of the interrogation focused on establishing the timeline of the pregnancies and the physical mechanics of the concealment. Detectives approached the questioning linearly, attempting to match the estimated ages of the mummified remains with specific calendar years. Huntsman did not attempt to fabricate an alibi or deny ownership of the sealed containers. Instead, she began a systematic chronological admission that left the investigators operating in a state of professional disbelief. She explained that during the 10-year window, she had viewed each impending birth not as a human transition, but as a logistical crisis that required immediate termination to protect her access to narcotics. Her internal logic was entirely survivalist. A newborn child would inevitably attract medical professionals, social services, and financial tracking, which would instantly expose her severe substance abuse to the community. To dissolve the defense's ability to claim a sudden, drug-induced psychotic break during a single event, detectives meticulously documented the repetitive nature of her actions. Huntsman described how she would monitor her own labor, waiting for intervals when the house was completely empty before delivering the infants on her bathroom floor. She admitted to utilizing her bare hands or strips of household cloth to cut off the airway of each child within seconds of delivery, confirming that she could hear them breathing before she applied the pressure. Pathologists at the state lab were simultaneously conducting X-ray scans on the mummified skeletal structures, looking for indicators of live birth, such as hydrostatic lung inflation, to corroborate her admissions. While Huntsman's confession provided the behavioral layout of the crimes, it simultaneously triggered a massive, complex tracking operation regarding potential co-conspirators. The primary red herring that consumed the first phase of the wider investigation centered on Darren West. Detectives found it mechanically difficult to accept that an adult male could reside in the same modest domestic space for a decade, engaging in an intimate relationship with a spouse, without ever noticing 7 distinct full-term pregnancies or the physical extraction of newborns. The investigation expanded to dissect West's entire history, his daily movements, and his communication logs from the drug distribution networks he had operated before his federal incarceration. For several weeks, the case stalled in a maze of structural dead ends. Search teams re-entered the residence on East 200 South with high-intensity alternative light sources, looking for blood tracking patterns, hidden medical documentation, or any physical indication that West had assisted in the cleanup or packaging of the containers. Investigators interviewed dozens of associates from the local drug trade, working under the hypothesis that the concealment was a mutual agreement to avoid drawing police attention to a high-volume drug house. West was subjected to multiple rounds of intensive polygraph examinations and detailed profiling by state behavioral analysts. The breakthrough that cleared this investigative bottleneck came from the state forensic laboratory's DNA profiling unit. Pathologists extracted viable genetic material from the deep bone tissue of the 6 mummified infants and compared the markers against reference samples provided by both Huntsman and West. The molecular data returned a definitive, unyielding result. West was indeed the biological father of all the infants. However, the subsequent forensic analysis of the packing materials, the tape adhesive, and the unique fiber transfers found on the sealed containers showed zero indication of a second contributor. The physical prints and hair fragments recovered from the airtight seals belonged exclusively to Huntsman. Behavioral analysts concluded that the heavy, continuous cloud of methamphetamine production and consumption within the household had created a symbiotic state of extreme mutual neglect. West's cognitive functions were so entirely absorbed by his own criminal liabilities and substance-induced paranoia that he was functionally blind to the physical transformations occurring within his own bed. Outside the police facility, the social echo of the investigation had completely paralyzed the local community. Pleasant Grove was a town that built its identity on child safety and neighborly transparency, and the realization that a multi-year serial infanticide had occurred in plain sight caused a profound breakdown of social trust. Local media outlets maintained a 24-hour presence outside the police tape, while online forums were flooded with volatile speculation regarding the daughters who had grown up in the home. Rumors suggested that the surviving children must have been complicit, or that the extended family had deliberately covered up the crimes to protect the family's standing in the local church. The police department was forced to issue public statements defending the children's status as victims of a profound domestic deception. Neighbors who had walked past the garage for years expressed an acute sense of retroactive horror, realizing that the muted, unmemorable woman they had trusted to watch their own toddlers had been operating a private burial network just inches from their property lines. The final stage of the investigation involved a detailed psychological reconstruction of Huntsman's cognitive state during the active years of the offenses. State psychiatrists spent weeks evaluating her history, looking for indicators of severe postpartum depression, dissociative identity disorders, or secondary psychoses. The clinical findings, however, returned a far more calculated and chilling reality. Huntsman did not exhibit a lack of contact with reality. She possessed an acute, manipulative understanding of her environment. Her actions were defined by a highly structured form of maternal compartmentalization. She was entirely capable of providing baseline care, affection, and protection to her 3 older daughters because their existence was already legitimized within the community, while simultaneously treating her unborn infants as inanimate objects that had to be clinically discarded. The investigation concluded that her dependency on methamphetamine had not erased her agency. It had merely streamlined her capacity for absolute, cold-blooded utility, allowing her to systematically execute a decade of human life to preserve the silent, toxic equilibrium of her daily routine. The judicial conclusion of the state's case against Megan Huntsman moved from the investigative files to the 4th District Court in Provo, Utah, in early 2015. The physical setting of the court was defined by rigid wood paneling, heavy fluorescent lighting, and rows of silently packed benches filled with local residents and national media representatives. Huntsman entered the room wearing standard orange jail attire, her physical posture remaining as stooped and diminutive as it had been during her initial arrest. She waived her right to a full preliminary hearing, a strategic decision by the defense that prevented the public presentation of the most graphic forensic autopsy images, effectively fast-tracking the case directly to sentencing. In February 2015, Huntsman entered a surprise plea of guilty to 6 counts of first-degree felony murder. By pleading guilty, she avoided a prolonged capital trial where prosecutors had been openly weighing the pursuit of the death penalty. Her defense team attempted to introduce mitigating arguments, presenting clinical assessments that focused heavily on her decades-long severe chemical dependency. They argued that the persistent consumption of high-grade methamphetamine had fundamentally altered her cognitive wiring, creating a permanent state of emotional detachment and survival-driven panic that rendered her incapable of rational maternal decision-making. The prosecution countered this narrative by emphasizing the clinical, highly organized nature of the concealment. They asserted that her ability to systematically execute 6 separate life cycles, clear the biological traces from the home, and apply airtight packaging to the containers demonstrated a sophisticated level of situational awareness that completely contradicted the image of an out-of-control, chaotic drug addict. The surviving family members chose not to deliver extensive victim impact statements in open court, opting instead to submit private written letters to the bench to shield the 3 surviving daughters from further public media exposure. During the final sentencing hearing in April 2015, Judge Daryl McMcAfee addressed Huntsman directly, stating that the court had rarely encountered a scenario defined by such a complete and calculated abdication of basic human responsibility. He noted that while her addiction was severe, it could never serve as a legal or moral justification for a decade of systematic homicide. The court ordered the maximum penalty allowed under the plea agreement, 6 consecutive terms of 5 years to life in prison. In the state of Utah, this structural arrangement effectively guaranteed that Huntsman would spend the remainder of her natural life behind bars, as the State Board of Pardons would treat the consecutive nature of the sentences as a permanent barrier to parole. Huntsman was immediately remanded to the custody of the Utah State Prison in Draper, departing the courtroom without looking back at the gallery or offering a single public statement of remorse. The physical remnants of the house on East 200 South were eventually cleared, the structure sold, and the interior completely renovated, but the structural memory of the decade-long deception remained permanently embedded in the landscape of Pleasant Grove. The concrete floor of the garage, once a silent depository for 6 human lives, now sits empty, a sterile utility space indistinguishable from any other suburban carport. Huntsman remains isolated within the state correctional system, her existence completely reduced to an inmate identification number and the rigid, unchanging routine of a maximum security facility. The 6 mummified infants, who never received names, legal documentation, or public recognition during their brief existence, were eventually transferred to a quiet, unmarked plot in the local cemetery, buried in total silence, far away from the frantic chemical survival that had dictated their ends. The true legacy of the case is not found in the legal paperwork or the prison logs, but in the permanent emotional hollowing of the surviving daughters, who must navigate their adult lives knowing that the quiet woman who raised them had carefully filed their siblings away behind the family storage bins. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. In 2011, a self-published romance novelist penned a 700-word essay titled How to Murder Your Husband. She coldly outlined motives, financial freedom, infidelity, abuse, and methodically weighed the pros and cons of poison, heavy objects, and firearms. 7 years later, that dark fiction bled into reality. On a damp June morning in Portland, Oregon, a revered culinary instructor was found bleeding out on the cold kitchen tiles of his own classroom. 2 9mm bullets had ended his life. The author of the essay was his wife. This wasn't a paperback thriller. It was a calculated execution. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Daniel Brophy was a man anchored by the earth. At 63, he had built a life out of the tangible: soil, roots, heat, and steel. As a lead instructor at the Oregon Culinary Institute in Southwest Portland, Dan was less a teacher and more a quiet patriarch of the local food scene. His classroom was an industrial sanctuary of gleaming prep tables and heavy cast iron pans, a space that smelled perpetually of roasted bones, reducing stocks, and clarified butter. He demanded precision over the sharp clatter of French knives against cutting boards. Dan did not chase culinary trends. He was a pioneer of the farm-to-table movement long before it became a marketable aesthetic. He spent his weekends tramping through the damp, moss-heavy forests of the Pacific Northwest, foraging for wild mushrooms and bringing his hauls back to the Institute. He possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of mycology, marine biology, and agriculture. Students remembered him as a demanding but profoundly nurturing mentor. He had a dry, eccentric sense of humor, often arriving to class wearing a novelty plastic clam necklace or making deadpan jokes about the proper way to butcher livestock. He raised chickens in his backyard, cultivated extensive vegetable gardens, and moved through life with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he valued. Dan was entirely authentic. His wife lived in an entirely different reality. Nancy Crampton Brophy, 68 at the time of the incident, spent her days engineering betrayals. She was a self-published author of romantic suspense novels. While Dan's world was rooted in the physical labor of the kitchen and hauling 50-pound sacks of flour, Nancy's existed behind the glaring light of a computer monitor in a quiet suburban room. Her fictional universe was populated by rugged military men, dangerous cartels, and women who solved their domestic problems with sudden, calculated violence. Her bibliography featured titles centered heavily on themes of deception and lethal choices. Most notably, a series focusing on the wrong cop, the wrong hero, and the wrong husband. Her protagonists were invariably middle-aged women feeling trapped by their circumstances, seeking escape hatches from mundane lives through explosive means. Nancy poured her energy into writing about strong-willed heroines, outsmarting the authorities, and walking away with massive, untraceable fortunes. But the reality of her publishing career was starkly unglamorous. The books barely generated enough revenue to cover the cost of formatting and printing them. The lucrative, high-stakes universe she commanded on paper was a sharp, mocking contrast to her actual financial standing. To support her writing habit and keep the household afloat, Nancy worked a day job selling Medicare insurance policies. It was a grueling, unromantic hustle involving endless cold calls and rejection. A far cry from the multi-million-dollar trusts she bestowed upon her fictional characters. The mounting credit card bills in their Portland home stood in stark opposition to the wealth she fantasized about daily. Friends and acquaintances viewed Nancy as outgoing, sharply intelligent, and intensely dedicated to her craft, even if it lacked commercial success. She attended local writers' groups, actively participating in seminars on plot pacing and character development. In these circles, she was known for her morbid sense of humor. She frequently joked about the logistics of getting away with murder, treating it as an academic exercise necessary for her genre. She would corner forensic experts and retired law enforcement officers at writers' conventions, pressing them for details on untraceable poisons, the mechanics of close-range gunshot wounds, and police procedural loopholes. At the time, her peers assumed this was merely the intense dedication of a suspense writer aiming for complete authenticity. The psychological profile that emerged painted a portrait of a woman deeply dissatisfied with the boundaries of her reality. Nancy craved the financial liberation she wrote about. She spent countless hours researching the mechanics of death, cloaked in the legitimate excuse of literary research. Dan brought home foraged truffles and fresh eggs, while Nancy mentally cataloged the most efficient ways to stop a human heart. They occupied the same house, but lived in parallel universes. One was building a legacy of nourishment, while the other was quietly drafting a tragedy. Their collision was entirely unremarkable for the early 1990s, a quiet intersection of two distinct worlds. Nancy enrolled in a continuing education culinary class, where Daniel happened to be the instructor. She found herself immediately drawn to his absolute competence. While she spun wild, uncontrollable narratives in her head, Dan worked entirely with his hands. He manipulated heat, fat, and salt into something concrete and nourishing. He was a man rooted in the physical realm, and she found that grounding. They courted through shared meals and long walks in the Oregon drizzle, eventually marrying in the winter of 1999. To the outside world, they were an eccentric Portland archetype. They purchased a modest, single-story home on a quiet suburban street, complete with a deep 50-foot backyard. Dan immediately went to work, transforming the lot into a miniature agricultural compound. He built sturdy wooden coops for a flock of chickens, erected raised beds for heirloom tomatoes, and turned the soil with the mechanical rhythm of a man entirely at peace with his station in life. He did not ask for more. Nancy, conversely, retreated to the spare bedroom, her designated writing sanctuary. While Dan was outside in the 40-degree rain hauling 50-pound bags of compost, she sat bathed in the artificial glow of her monitor, dreaming of millions. They divided the architecture of their marriage cleanly. Dan managed the physical maintenance of their lives, the cooking, the cleaning, the yard work. Nancy took complete control of the administration. She managed the bank accounts, the tax filings, the household budget. It was an arrangement built on implicit trust. Dan handed over his paychecks from the Culinary Institute, believing the foundation of their life was secure. He had no reason to suspect the floorboards were rotting beneath him. The decay was slow, a creeping mold rather than a sudden fire. Nancy's publishing career required immense capital. Self-publishing is not a meritocracy. It is a brutal business of paid advertising, cover design formatting, and marketing algorithms. She poured resources into promoting her romantic suspense novels, convinced that the next book would be the one to break through and deliver the windfall she felt she was owed. But the massive royalties never materialized. The market was heavily saturated, and her book simply languished in the digital abyss, generating pennies on the dollar. To bridge the gaping hole between Dan's teaching salary and their actual expenses, Nancy began opening hidden credit lines. When one card maxed out at 20% interest, she opened another, transferring balances in a desperate shell game. The postal carrier brought mounting evidence of their insolvency every afternoon, but since Nancy intercepted and controlled the mail, Dan never saw the statements. By 2017, the facade was buckling under its own immense weight. The couple was drowning in tens of thousands of dollars of unsecured, high-interest debt. They had quietly bled Dan's retirement savings dry just to keep the lights on and the mortgage current. The house, the very symbol of their stability, was on the verge of slipping through their fingers. Desperate to patch the hull of their sinking finances, Nancy took a grinding, soul-crushing job selling Medicare insurance to the elderly. She hated the work. It required her to spend hours on the phone, pitching policies to people on fixed incomes, a stark and humiliating reminder of her own financial precariousness. Yet behind closed doors, this job taught Nancy an invaluable, dark lesson. She spent months becoming intimately familiar with the mechanics of life insurance, the underwriting processes, the payout structures, the specific clauses that dictate how and when a beneficiary receives a check. She learned exactly how to calculate the precise monetary value of a human life. The pressure within the suburban home began to shift. Dan, finally sensing the tightening budget even if he didn't know the exact catastrophic numbers, suggested the most logical, practical solution for a couple entering their late 60s. They needed to sell the house. They could downsize, wipe out whatever debt they had with the home's equity, and move into a smaller, more manageable apartment. For Nancy, this proposal was entirely unacceptable. Selling the house meant public failure. It meant losing her private office, her status in the neighborhood, and the comfortable illusion of middle-class success she had projected to her writing groups. She vehemently rejected the idea, repeatedly insisting they could weather the storm. Dan's life was heavily insured. Over the years, Nancy had meticulously maintained several overlapping policies on him. There was a substantial life insurance policy provided by the Culinary Institute. There were secondary policies she had purchased independently, alongside mortgage protection plans. All told, in the event of Daniel Brophy's sudden, unexpected death, the tax-free payout would exceed $1.4 million. The psychological pivot occurred in the quiet, isolated hours of early 2018. Nancy stopped viewing her husband as a partner and began viewing him as a severely depreciating asset. Alive, Dan was a modest salary and a persistent demand to sell her beloved home. Dead, he was a winning lottery ticket. In her mind, the people in her life had ceased to be flesh and blood. They were reduced to faceless white mannequins, blank props she could pose, manipulate, and ultimately discard to fit the narrative arc of her own survival. She didn't snap in a fit of rage. She did not act out of sudden passion. The transition from romance novelist to architect of an execution was methodical, cold, and profoundly bureaucratic. She simply applied the same meticulous plotting she used for her fiction to her actual life. She needed a murder weapon that could not be traced. She needed an alibi that would hold up against a police timeline. And she needed to execute the crime in a space where her husband felt entirely secure, a place where his guard would be completely down. The Oregon Culinary Institute opened its doors before dawn. Nancy knew this routine perfectly. She knew the exact window of time when Daniel would be completely alone. June 2nd, 2018, broke over Portland under a heavy, bruised sky. The ambient temperature hovered around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, accompanied by the relentless, misting rain typical of the Pacific Northwest. For Daniel Brophy, it was merely another Saturday morning. He moved through the pre-dawn darkness with the ingrained, mechanical efficiency of a man who had spent 4 decades waking up before the rest of the world. He dressed quietly in the dim light of the bedroom, pulling on his sturdy work boots and a heavy fleece jacket. He stepped out into the deep backyard, his boots sinking slightly into the saturated earth, and carried a bucket of grain to the chicken coops. The damp air smelled of wet cedar and ozone. He checked the perimeter of his raised vegetable beds, secured the latches on the pens, and returned inside to grab his keys. By 7 in the morning, Daniel was behind the wheel of his truck, navigating the slick, empty streets towards southwest Portland. The 10-mile drive was a quiet transition from the sanctuary of his home to the industrial reality of his classroom. He did not look back at the house. He had no reason to suspect that the woman he had just left sleeping in the master bedroom was already awake, already moving, and already initiating a countdown. Nancy's morning was an exercise in absolute, clinical detachment. She did not reach for her modern smartphone. She left the device plugged into the wall on her nightstand, a deliberate, calculated decision designed to anchor her digital footprint to the physical address of their suburban home. If investigators ever checked the cellular tower pings, the data would insist she had been asleep in her bed. She bypassed her newer vehicle entirely. Instead, she retrieved the keys to an old, gray Toyota Sienna minivan they rarely used. It lacked Bluetooth connectivity, integrated GPS navigation, or any modern telemetry that could record its ignition cycles or physical coordinates. Nancy dressed in dark, nondescript clothing. She carried a heavy canvas tote bag. Inside the bag rested the culmination of months of obsessive, morbid research. It was a 9mm Glock, but not one purchased through traditional, traceable channels. Nancy had exploited a massive loophole in federal firearms regulations. Months prior, she had attended a local gun show and purchased a ghost gun kit, an 80% complete polymer receiver lacking a serial number. She had then scoured the internet, quietly purchasing a separate slide and a replacement barrel. Her plan was a masterpiece of forensic countermeasures. She intended to shoot her husband with the aftermarket barrel, extract the brass casings, and then swap the original unfired barrel back into the weapon. If the police ever seized the gun and test-fired it for ballistic comparison, The striations on the test bullets would never match the slugs pulled from Daniel's chest. It was a theoretical perfection she had likely drafted for one of her faceless white mannequins in her novels. Now, she was applying the theory to warm flesh. Nancy slid behind the wheel of the Toyota minivan and backed out into the rain. She chose a specific route through the city grid, weaving through older residential neighborhoods and avoiding major toll bridges and interstate highways where traffic cameras were obvious. She was a ghost navigating a sleeping city. At 7:20 in the morning, Daniel Brophy arrived at the Oregon Culinary Institute. The building was a massive converted warehouse space on Southwest Jefferson Street, characterized by large glass windows and heavy industrial architecture. He unlocked the main entrance, stepped into the dark foyer, and punched his access code into the security panel. The system chimed, disarming the perimeter. The electronic logs recorded his entry. He locked the front doors behind him, a standard protocol for instructors arriving early, and walked down the long, shadowed hallway toward kitchen number 1. The environment was a sensory overload of stainless steel, white subway tile, and the lingering, sharp scent of industrial bleach mixed with the ghost of yesterday's roasted garlic. Daniel switched on the overhead fluorescent banks. The lights buzzed, flickering to life and illuminating rows of commercial gas ranges, massive steel ventilation hoods, and deep triple basin sinks. He dropped his bags on a prep table, tied a white apron around his waist, and moved toward the sinks to begin filling the ice baths required for the morning's culinary demonstrations. The heavy rush of cold water hitting the stainless steel basin drowned out all other ambient noise. He was completely isolated. He was entirely focused. Several blocks away, the gray minivan rolled to a slow halt. Nancy parked on a side street, blending seamlessly into the rows of identical, waterlogged vehicles. She grabbed the canvas tote bag, stepped out into the drizzle, and walked briskly toward the rear entrance of the institute. She knew the building's vulnerabilities perfectly. She knew Daniel routinely propped the rear delivery doors open to load supplies, or that he left specific side entrances unlocked for early arriving faculty. She slipped inside undetected. The corridors were silent, save for the distant, echoing rush of running water coming from kitchen number 1. Nancy moved down the hallway. The soft rubber soles of her shoes made no sound against the polished linoleum. She stepped into the doorway of the kitchen. Daniel was standing at the sink, his back to the room. The distance between them was less than 10 feet. There was no heated argument. There was no dramatic monologue or final demand for a divorce. Nancy reached into the canvas bag and wrapped her hand around the textured grip of the 9mm. She raised the weapon, aligning the sights squarely with the center of his broad back. Daniel turned. Perhaps he heard a shift in the air, or the subtle squeak of rubber on tile. He likely expected to see a sleepy first-year culinary student arriving early for a prep shift. Instead, he saw his wife. The first shot tore through the acoustics of the commercial kitchen with a deafening, concussive crack. The 9mm hollow point bullet struck Daniel in the upper torso. The kinetic energy of the impact threw him backward. The projectile severed his thoracic spine, instantly neutralizing his motor functions. He collapsed violently onto the hard, wet tiles, staring up at the fluorescent lights. He was paralyzed, rapidly hemorrhaging, but his brain was still desperately trying to process the catastrophic trauma. Nancy did not run. The blueprint in her mind required absolute certainty. She stepped forward, standing directly over the man who had built her garden boxes and shared her bed for 2 decades. She aimed the muzzle downward, pointing it directly at his chest. The second shot was an execution. The bullet pierced his heart at point-blank range. The sound echoed off the steel ventilation hoods, a sharp, violent punctuation mark ending a 20-year marriage. Nancy methodically picked up the 2 spent brass casings from the floor, leaving 0 physical evidence behind, dropped the smoking weapon back into her tote bag, and turned away. She walked back down the silent hallway, pushed through the exit doors, and vanished into the Oregon rain. By 7:45, the first wave of culinary students began to gather on the sidewalk outside the main entrance. They huddled under umbrellas, clutching coffees, waiting for Chef Brophy to unlock the heavy glass doors. When 8 o'clock arrived and the doors remained locked, a low murmur of confusion rippled through the group. Daniel was never late. He was the human metronome of the institute. A fellow instructor eventually arrived, using a master key to grant the students access. The group filed into the building, shaking off their wet umbrellas and moving down the corridors toward their respective stations. A small group of students pushed through the swinging double doors of kitchen number 1. The harsh fluorescent lights glared off the stainless steel. At the far end of the room, near the triple sinks, they saw a pair of boots protruding from behind a prep counter. A student stepped forward, calling out Daniel's name. There was no response. As they rounded the corner of the heavy steel table, the cognitive dissonance was immediate and overwhelming. Daniel Brophy was lying on his back on the anti-fatigue mat. At first glance, the students' brains completely rejected the concept of violence. They assumed their mentor had slipped on a wet tile, or perhaps suffered a sudden, massive cardiac event. A young woman rushed forward, dropping to her knees on the wet floor to check his pulse. Then the smell registered, a heavy metallic odor of blood and voided bowels, completely overpowering the scent of the kitchen sanitizer. Then they saw the pooling crimson spreading across the white tiles, soaking into the fabric of his apron. They saw the twin entry wounds in his chest. The kitchen erupted into chaos. A student violently pulled his phone from his pocket, his hands shaking so violently he could barely dial the 3 digits for emergency services. Screams echoed down the hallway, drawing more students and faculty into the doorway. The scene was absolute bedlam. Within minutes, the wail of sirens cut through the Portland morning. Paramedics charged into the building with heavy trauma kits, pushing through the crowd of horrified, weeping students. They dropped to the floor beside Daniel, frantically cutting away his fleece jacket and applying pressure to the chest wounds. But the biological reality was final. The damage was too catastrophic. The blood volume was gone. At 8:30 in the morning, on the floor of the kitchen he had commanded for years, Daniel Brophy was officially pronounced dead. The detectives who arrived minutes later immediately taped off the building, stepping into a puzzle that made absolutely no logical sense. The doors had been locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry. Daniel's wallet, containing hundreds of dollars in cash, was still in his pocket. His truck keys were on the table. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't a random act of street violence bleeding into the building. It was a targeted, ghost-like assassination. And the only person who benefited from it was currently back in her suburban bed, waiting for the police to arrive and deliver the terrible news. The knock on the door came mid-morning. 2 Portland homicide detectives stood on the damp concrete of the suburban porch, their expressions set in the grim, neutral masks required for death notifications. When Nancy opened the door, her performance began. She listened as they delivered the news of the shooting. Her reaction, a carefully calibrated display of disbelief and devastation. She slumped. She wept. She offered bewildered variations of the same question, asking who could possibly want to harm a man who spent his life teaching others how to bake bread and braise meat. She assured the investigators that her marriage was rock solid, completely omitting the crippling debt and the mounting tension over selling the property. To the detectives standing in her foyer, she presented the perfect image of a world abruptly shattered. The shockwave that hit the Portland food scene was profound. Daniel was not just an employee at the Oregon Culinary Institute. He was its vital, beating heart. By evening, news of the assassination had spread through the city's tight-knit network of chefs, restaurateurs, and alumni. The sheer senselessness of the act paralyzed the community. This was not a late-night altercation in a dangerous neighborhood. It was a brazen execution inside a brightly lit classroom at 8 in the morning. Within 24 hours, a massive vigil materialized on Southwest Jefferson Street. Hundreds of current and former students, colleagues, and locals gathered in the persistent Oregon drizzle. The sidewalk outside the converted warehouse transformed into a sprawling memorial. Bouquets of flowers, handwritten letters, and, fittingly, foraged mushrooms and fresh vegetables were piled high against the glass doors. The air grew thick with the smell of melting paraffin wax from hundreds of candles, mingling with the damp asphalt. People stood shoulder to shoulder, weeping openly, sharing stories of Daniel's eccentric humor and his quiet, steadfast mentorship. Nancy attended the vigil. She stood near the center of the grieving crowd, surrounded by her husband's devastated students. Observers later noted a distinct discordance in her demeanor. While the young chefs broke down in violent sobs, the widow remained remarkably composed. Her eyes were dry for long stretches, her gaze distant, occasionally offering a tight, melancholy smile to those who offered their condolences. Most attributed this stoicism to deep psychological shock, the protective numbness that often shields the human brain from acute trauma. The following day, she took her grief to the internet. Nancy published a statement on social media, informing her extended circle of the tragedy. She wrote that she was struggling to comprehend the loss of her best friend and partner, requesting that people give her a few days to process the reality of the situation before reaching out. It was a succinct, entirely normal digital artifact of modern mourning, yet it stood in stark, chilling contrast to her private actions. While the culinary community was paralyzed by grief, the homicide detectives were running headfirst into a solid brick wall. The crime scene inside kitchen number 1 was a forensic vacuum. Crime scene technicians spent days sweeping the stainless steel surfaces, the tile floors, and the heavy ventilation hoods. They found the 2 spent 9mm casings, which confirmed the caliber of the weapon, but nothing else. There were no latent fingerprints matching unknown subjects. There was no foreign DNA transferred during a struggle. The complete lack of defensive wounds on Daniel's body indicated a blitz attack, an ambush executed with terrifying efficiency. The initial theories leaned heavily toward a random intrusion. Detectives meticulously interviewed the homeless population in the nearby encampments, theorizing that a transient might have slipped through the propped delivery doors looking for food or valuables. But Daniel's wallet rested securely in his pocket, heavy with cash. His vehicle keys were untouched. A desperate intruder would not execute a man and leave hundreds of dollars behind. Investigators then shifted their focus to the student body and faculty. They combed through enrollment records, searching for anyone with a grievance. They looked for expelled students, disgruntled former employees, or anyone who might harbor a violent grudge against the demanding instructor. They conducted dozens of hours of interviews, cross-referencing alibis and tracking cell phone locations. Every single lead dissolved into useless mist. Daniel was universally beloved. He had no known enemies, no hidden vices, and absolutely no connection to the criminal underworld. The investigation stalled, trapped in a paradox of a highly professional hit on a thoroughly unremarkable gentleman. Then, the facade of the grieving widow began to crack, fractured not by a slip of the tongue, but by the cold machinery of administration. Barely 4 days after the shooting, before the memorial flowers had even begun to wilt on the sidewalk, Nancy initiated contact with the police department. She did not call to ask for updates on the manhunt. She called to request a formal letter from the lead detective, a document explicitly stating she was not a suspect in the homicide. She explained with a tone of brisk efficiency that the insurance companies required this clearance before they could disperse the payout on Daniel's life. The request struck the homicide unit like a physical blow. The administrative eagerness was profoundly jarring. The detectives stalled her, offering vague bureaucratic excuses while immediately shifting the entirety of their focus onto the woman demanding a $1 million payout before her husband's autopsy report was even finalized. The search for a random killer evaporated. The investigation pivoted, locking its sights directly on the quiet suburban house. The administrative eagerness of the widow fundamentally altered the trajectory of the homicide unit. The search for a random transient or a disgruntled culinary student evaporated. The detectives narrowed a massive citywide suspect pool down to a single, quiet suburban residence. They pulled back the curtain on the grieving widow and began a relentless excavation of the couple's private life. Financial forensics is an unglamorous, silent process executed through spreadsheets and encrypted banking portals. Investigators subpoenaed the household accounts, expecting to find the comfortable stability of a dual-income marriage nearing retirement. Instead, they uncovered a slaughterhouse of red ink. The illusion of middle-class prosperity collapsed entirely on paper. The couple was buried under a staggering mountain of unsecured consumer debt. Credit limits were maxed out, caught in a desperate, grinding cycle of balance transfers to delay default. The instructor's retirement savings had been aggressively drained, bled dry over years of unseen mismanagement. The Portland property, the very symbol of their stability, was teetering dangerously close to foreclosure. Yet amidst the financial ruin, One column of expenses was maintained with religious fervor: the life insurance premiums. Detectives noted that Nancy ensured those specific payments cleared every single month, even as the utility bills fell behind. She had cultivated a financial parachute, and the ripcord was her husband's violent end. The motive was established, but the physical mechanics of the crime remained a void. Nancy's initial statement to the police was a fortress of mundane details. She insisted she was asleep during the crucial window. Her smartphone corroborated the story, remaining plugged into the bedroom wall and anchoring her digital footprint to the home's cellular tower. In modern investigations, a phone's geographic location is routinely treated as a proxy for the human. The detectives, recognizing the sophistication of their suspect, separated the machine from the woman. They turned their attention away from the digital grid and focused on the physical assets in the driveway. The couple owned a newer SUV and a battered 2007 Toyota Sienna minivan. Nancy explicitly stated the minivan never moved that morning. The area surrounding the Oregon Culinary Institute is a dense matrix of commercial properties, automated traffic lights, and private security systems. Investigators embarked on a grueling, mind-numbing audit of localized video data. They built a 2-mile digital perimeter around Southwest Jefferson Street. For days, detectives stared at high-definition monitors, watching the rain-slicked, pre-dawn streets of Portland loop endlessly. It was a punishing visual sweep through a haystack of headlights and moving shadows. Then, a fracture in the widow's carefully constructed timeline. At 6:39 in the morning, a security camera mounted on a nearby pizza shop caught a grainy image of a gray minivan. The vehicle was navigating the narrow side streets, deliberately avoiding the main thoroughfares where high-resolution municipal traffic cameras operated. It moved with the cautious, deliberate pace of a predator utilizing the city's blind spots. The license plates were heavily obscured by the darkness and the relentless drizzle, but the physical anomalies of the vehicle were undeniable. The missing hubcap, a highly specific pattern of oxidized body damage, and the faded paint matched the Toyota sitting outside Nancy's front door with terrifying exactness. The cameras tracked the phantom minivan circling the institute. It parked on a side street. The driver waited in the dark. At 7:28, mere minutes after Daniel unlocked the kitchen doors and disarmed the alarm, the vehicle was still idling. At 7:30, the approximate time the hollow points destroyed the instructor's chest, the minivan pulled away from the curb. The driver kept the headlights entirely extinguished for several blocks, a tactical, calculated decision to avoid illuminating the license plate for any passing dash cams. The digital alibi of the sleeping smartphone was instantly dismantled by the undeniable physical reality of the rusted Toyota. The timeline placed her at the scene, but the 9mm weapon remained a ghost. A standard background check revealed Nancy legally owned a Glock pistol, purchased earlier that year. When detectives requested the firearm for analysis, she surrendered it without a trace of hesitation. The crime lab test-fired the gun. The ballistic striations on the test slugs, the microscopic grooves carved into the metal as the projectile travels down the barrel, did not match the bullets pulled from the victim's body. To an untrained investigator, this test would have completely cleared the firearm. But the digital forensics unit began excavating the widow's deleted internet history. They bypassed standard search queries, digging deep into cached browser receipts and encrypted commerce sites. The level of premeditation they uncovered was staggering. Nancy had not merely bought a handgun, she had engineered an untraceable instrument of death. Months prior to the execution, she had attended a local exposition and purchased an 80% complete polymer lower receiver, a ghost gun kit devoid of a serial number. Electronic receipts showed she then navigated to specialized tactical websites to purchase an aftermarket Glock slide and an independent secondary barrel. The homicide detectives realized the sheer architectural brilliance of her design. It was a forensic countermeasure ripped directly from the pages of a discarded thriller manuscript. She had assembled the weapon using the secondary, untraceable barrel. She drove to the Culinary Institute, committed the murder, and pocketed the spent brass casings. Upon returning to the quiet suburban house, she systematically dismantled the firearm. She removed the aftermarket barrel, the only piece of metal containing the unique ballistic signature of the crime, and replaced it with the pristine, unfired original barrel. If the police ever seized the gun, the barrel swap would theoretically guarantee her innocence. The authorities did not alert her to the collapsing perimeter. They let her continue the performance. For 3 months, the author lived comfortably inside her fiction. She accepted heavy casseroles from grieving neighbors. She aggressively petitioned the underwriters for the life insurance check. She believed her plot was entirely airtight. On a crisp morning in early September, the illusion was permanently terminated. Portland detectives intercepted the widow as she pulled her vehicle out of the suburban driveway. There was no dramatic pursuit, no tense negotiation. The officers simply ordered her out onto the asphalt and secured her hands in heavy steel cuffs. She stared at the detectives with a cold, unreadable expression. The woman who had authored a literal manual on spousal homicide was processed for the exact crime. Her fictional arrogance utterly undone by the relentless, grinding machinery of forensic science. The courtroom proceedings finally commenced in the spring of 2022, delayed heavily by global events. By the time the defendant took the stand, she was 71 years old, her hair entirely white, her demeanor a chilling study in absolute composure. She sat before the judge, projecting the carefully constructed image of a frail, grieving widow targeted by an overzealous police department. Her defense strategy was an audacious blend of literary excuse and convenient medical anomaly. When confronted with the undeniable video evidence of her rusted Toyota Sienna circling the Culinary Institute, she introduced a claim of retrograde amnesia. She stated under oath that the profound trauma of losing her partner had entirely wiped her memory of that specific morning. If she had been driving the vehicle in that neighborhood, she suggested, it was merely to buy a cup of coffee and outline a new manuscript. An innocent suburban errand completely erased from her mind by the subsequent shock. The prosecution systematically dismantled this narrative with forensic precision. They displayed the ruinous financial records, the hidden credit cards, and the staggering life insurance policies waiting in the wings. When pressed about the untraceable firearm components, the author leaned heavily on her profession. She testified that the polymer ghost gun kit and the aftermarket barrel were acquired strictly for research purposes. She insisted she needed to understand the physical mechanics of building a completely untraceable weapon to accurately portray the assembly process in an upcoming novel. It was a defense that demanded the court blur the line between a paperback thriller and the very real execution that took place on the kitchen tiles. The 12 men and women in the jury box refused to blur those lines. They viewed the amnesia claim as a desperate fabrication and the literary research excuse as a thinly veiled confession. The trial lasted over a month, but the final deliberation was remarkably swift. After just 2 days of reviewing the intricate ballistic countermeasures and the crushing financial motive, the jury returned. They found the author guilty of second-degree murder. There was no visible reaction from the defense table, no gasps, no tears, no dramatic collapse. The architect of the crime simply stared straight ahead, her expression locked in cold, clinical detachment. A judge subsequently sentenced her to life in prison, ensuring the massive insurance payout would permanently remain a piece of fiction. Nancy Crampton Brophy spent her life spinning tales of desperate women claiming power through violence. But there is no poetic justice in a commercial kitchen on a damp Oregon morning. Only a man who loved the earth, bleeding out on cold tile. She believed she could outright reality, scripting a flawless crime to secure a stolen fortune. A digital ping in the dead of night, followed by a single image capable of fracturing a family permanently. It wasn't just a blind demand for cash. The encrypted message contained a photograph of a loved one, bruised, bound, and bleeding, accompanied by a staggering financial ultimatum. This wasn't a remote, lawless outpost. This was 2023, right in the heart of one of the most heavily surveilled cities on the planet. Thomas Kwan and Tan Nguyen were abruptly dragged into a vortex of primal brutality, wrapped inside a highly calculated extortion plot. The captors were explicit, leaving a blood-soaked physical trail to prove their intent. By the time authorities intercepted the first drop, it became horrifyingly clear. The true cost of this ransom would never be measured in currency alone. Help this channel grow Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Thomas Kwan operated within a world defined by logistics, margins, and unrelenting pressure. He was a first-generation professional who internalized the heavy expectations of his family, translating that burden into a rigorous, almost punishing work ethic. By his early 30s, Thomas had carved out a highly specialized niche within the commercial freight sector of New South Wales. His firm managed the importation of premium, high-value assets, ranging from specialized automotive parts to industrial-grade medical equipment, routing cargo across thousands of miles of international waters before it ever touched the tarmac. He was pragmatic and intensely private, a man who preferred the cold certainty of spreadsheets to the unpredictable nature of social networking. Those who worked alongside him described a sharp, analytical mind, constantly assessing variables and mitigating risks. He maintained a disciplined physical routine, prioritizing efficiency in every aspect of his life, keeping his 165-pound frame conditioned through rigorous early morning workouts long before the rest of the city had even woken up. His operational counterpart and close confidant, Tan Nguyen, provided the essential social friction needed to keep their enterprise expanding. Tan possessed an entirely different psychological makeup. Where Thomas was anchored in data and risk management, Tan was the charismatic architect of their client relationships. He understood the nuanced psychology of negotiation, capable of reading a room and disarming tension with calculated ease. Tan's background was rooted in hospitality and high-end retail, environments that taught him how to project affluence and competence, a skill that proved invaluable when securing contracts with elite international suppliers. However, this required Tan to maintain a highly visible profile. He drove a luxury sedan, wore tailored suits, and frequently hosted prospective clients at exclusive venues. This projection of wealth was a deliberate business strategy, a mechanism to signal stability and success in a fiercely competitive market. Together, their partnership was a carefully balanced equation. They occupied a sprawling 4,000-square-foot warehouse and office complex situated in a heavy industrial zone on the periphery of the city. It was an environment characterized by the constant drone of idling diesel engines and the metallic clatter of shipping containers. During the peak summer months, when temperatures inside the uninsulated facility routinely spiked past 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the two men could often be found working late into the evening, long after their administrative staff had gone home. This dedication was the bedrock of their financial ascent. They were accumulating substantial liquid assets, securing lucrative contracts, and rapidly expanding their operational footprint. Yet, this aggressive expansion inadvertently created a dangerous illusion. To the outside observer, the constant flow of premium goods, the luxury vehicles parked outside the loading bays, and their rapid corporate growth painted a picture of limitless, immediately accessible wealth. They were perceived not as hardworking businessmen, leveraging heavy debt and tight margins, but as highly lucrative targets sitting on vast reserves of cash. The reality of their financial structure, tied up in escrow accounts, customs bonds, and pending invoices, was invisible to the untrained eye. What was visible was simply the manifestation of their success. The industrial park where they based their operations was a labyrinth of corrugated steel and cracked concrete, spanning dozens of acres. After sunset, the area transformed into a desolate grid of amber streetlights and deep shadows. Security in the sector was fragmented, relying mostly on automated gates and solitary night watchmen patrolling vast distances. Thomas had installed a robust, closed-circuit surveillance system around their specific unit, but technology is only a deterrent, not a physical barrier. He spent considerable time auditing their security protocols, yet his focus was entirely on protecting the cargo. His mindset was calibrated to defend against property theft, a common occurrence in the freight industry, rather than personal, targeted violence. Tan, meanwhile, was actively expanding their digital footprint. He managed their corporate presence online, inadvertently leaving a digital trail of their acquisitions and successful bids. In the modern era, an ambitious business profile serves as a beacon. The perpetrators utilized this open-source intelligence, piecing together a comprehensive dossier on their targets. They understood that Thomas and Tan were not affiliated with any protective syndicates or criminal networks. They were legitimate, independent operators. This made them soft targets, individuals with access to significant capital, but lacking the ruthless infrastructure to retaliate. Their personal lives were equally compartmentalized. Thomas lived in a heavily secured apartment complex, valuing solitude and quiet decompression after enduring 14-hour shifts on the warehouse floor. He rarely discussed his financial status with his extended family, preferring to quietly cover their medical expenses or household repairs without fanfare. Tan, conversely, supported a large multi-generational household. He was the primary financial pillar for his aging parents and younger siblings, a responsibility that drove his relentless pursuit of new accounts. Both men were fundamentally anchored by a deep sense of familial duty, their ambitions driven by the desire to insulate their loved ones from economic hardship. This psychological profile, two men deeply committed to their families, highly successful, yet operating in isolated industrial environments during late hours, formed the perfect, tragic matrix for extortion. The groundwork for the ransom was laid not in a sudden flash of violent inspiration, but through weeks of cold, methodical observation. The victims were being profiled, their routines logged, and their vulnerabilities mapped out with chilling precision, all while they continued to focus entirely on building their future. The broker was an entire fabrication. He was a forward scout for a localized extortion ring, a highly structured, ruthless cell that operated on the absolute fringes of the city's legitimate commercial sector. This syndicate did not deal in narcotics or street-level vice. They specialized in high-yield, targeted financial extraction. They hunted independently wealthy business owners who lacked the protective muscle of larger corporations. Tan, with his tailored aesthetic and vocal ambition, registered as the perfect mark. The scout engaged Tan in a lengthy, calculated conversation, extracting crucial details about the warehouse's operational volume, delivery schedules, and the specific hours when the administrative staff clocked out. It was a flawless social engineering extraction, disguised as mutual corporate synergy. Tan walked away with a promising new contact. The syndicate walked away with the blueprint for a siege. Over the next 6 weeks, the reconnaissance phase commenced. The predators did not rush. They applied a methodical, chilling patience to their surveillance. A heavy, dark gray SUV, weighing easily over 5,000 pounds with deeply tinted windows, began appearing in the industrial grid surrounding the warehouse. It never parked in the same location twice. One evening, it would idle near the concrete storm drain outlet, roughly 400 feet from the loading bay. 2 nights later, it would be positioned behind a rusted chain-link fence on an adjacent, abandoned lot. The operatives inside logged every single variable of their target's routine. They noted the exact time the perimeter security lights activated. They documented the 15-minute gap between the departure of the last forklift operator and the moment Thomas finally triggered the electronic deadbolts on the main office door. They even mapped the physical blind spots in the external camera network, calculating the precise angles where a human figure could slip through the amber glow of the street lamps completely undetected. The presence of this surveillance vehicle initiated a subtle but distinct social echo within the industrial community. The environment was a tight-knit ecosystem of blue-collar mechanics, overnight freight loaders, and early morning dispatchers. Strangers were easily spotted. An elderly security guard patrolling a neighboring textile plant reported a deep, lingering unease after noticing the same dark vehicle lingering near the intersection for 3 consecutive nights. A diesel mechanic working late shifts mentioned to his floor manager that an unfamiliar car was constantly tracking the traffic flow in and out of the sector. Yet these observations remained fragmented. In an industrial zone characterized by transient truck drivers and irregular shipping schedules, anomalies were almost always dismissed as mundane logistical quirks. No one elevated their concerns to law enforcement. The unease hung in the cold night air, where temperatures often dipped down to a damp 45 degrees Fahrenheit, like an invisible, toxic fog that everyone breathed but no one chose to acknowledge. Inside the targeted warehouse, the tension was entirely different. Thomas was hyper-focused on a critical backlog of incoming inventory. He spent hours on the concrete floor, physically auditing pallets of high-value components, surrounded by the metallic scent of machine oil and the sharp tang of ozone radiating from the electric forklifts. He was a man consumed by the micromechanics of his business. There were minor disruptions that, in hindsight, were glaring red flags: a series of dropped calls on their secure landline, a momentary power fluctuation that briefly disabled the perimeter sensors, a heavy padlock on a secondary utility gate found unlatched. Thomas attributed these incidents to aging infrastructure and municipal grid issues. His mind, strictly calibrated for data and profit margins, simply did not process the possibility of a coordinated human threat. He was preparing for a financial audit, completely oblivious to the fact that his physical life was currently being audited by men who viewed him solely as a walking vault. The syndicate's psychological profile was rooted in absolute sociopathic pragmatism. The cell leader, a veteran of several violent standovers, understood that traditional robbery was a flawed, outdated model. Stealing physical goods required transport, storage, and fencing, a complex chain of custody that invariably left digital and physical footprints. Extortion, however, cut out the middleman. By targeting the owners directly and leveraging extreme physical trauma, they could force a massive, instantaneous transfer of liquid wealth. They didn't want the cargo. They wanted the capital that purchased the cargo. To achieve this, they needed to strip Thomas and Tan of their perceived corporate power and reduce them to a state of primal, paralyzing terror. The plan required absolute isolation, profound sensory deprivation, and a rapid escalation of violence to ensure immediate compliance. To spring the trap, the syndicate utilized the contact established during the Harbor Symposium. The fake customs broker reached out to Tan with an urgent, highly lucrative proposal. He claimed to have secured a rare, expedited clearance window for a massive shipment of hardware stuck in bureaucratic limbo. The catch was the timing. The paperwork needed physical signatures and an immediate cash retainer, and the meeting had to occur late on a Friday evening, a time when the industrial park essentially became a ghost town. It was a classic isolation tactic, exploiting Tan's aggressive business drive and his desire to secure the deal before the weekend. Tan agreed to the meeting, instructing Thomas to remain at the warehouse to process the impending paperwork. As the week drew to a close, the atmosphere inside the facility grew dense with anticipation of the upcoming deal. Thomas worked tirelessly, organizing the loading bays and preparing the staging areas. He skipped his usual meals, surviving on black coffee and sheer adrenaline. The warehouse, vast and cavernous, echoed with the solitary sounds of his boots against the concrete. Outside, the dark SUV took its final position. The operatives reviewed their tactical gear: heavy-duty zip ties, thick rolls of duct tape, encrypted burner phones, and heavy steel batons. They checked their watches, calculating the exact minute the sun would drop below the horizon, plunging the sector into deep, impenetrable shadows. The social echo in the surrounding streets finally faded into dead silence. The neighboring businesses locked their heavy iron gates. The long-haul diesel trucks rolled out toward the interstate, leaving the grid to settle into its weekend dormancy. Inside the operation vehicle, the attackers breathed in the stale, recirculated air of the cabin, their eyes fixed on the illuminated windows of the main office. They were no longer observing. The planning phase was officially terminated. Every variable had been accounted for, every risk brutally mitigated. They were simply waiting for the digital clock on the dashboard to strike the agreed-upon hour. The threshold between legitimate commerce and unimaginable violence was about to be crossed, entirely by design, fueled by a relentless greed that saw human life only as collateral against a payout. The dashboard clock in the heavy SUV hit the designated hour. The temperature outside plummeted to a damp 40 degrees Fahrenheit. 3 miles away from the main warehouse, the charismatic partner parked his luxury sedan near the edge of an abandoned commercial development. The fake broker had cited extreme discretion for this meeting location. The sprawling asphalt lot was completely devoid of artificial light. He killed the engine. The silence was absolute. He checked his phone, waiting for the contact to arrive, his mind entirely focused on the impending logistics contract. Instead, the dark utility vehicle rolled out from behind a concrete retaining wall, cutting off the only exit route. High-beam headlights blinded him. 4 figures in dark, unmarked tactical gear swarmed his sedan, A heavy steel breaching tool shattered the driver's side window. Glass rained across the premium leather interior. Thick, gloved hands dragged the businessman onto the freezing asphalt. A knee dropped with crushing force onto his lower spine, driving the air from his lungs. Thick nylon zip ties bit into his wrists, cutting off circulation instantly. A coarse canvas bag was pulled violently over his head, suffocating his panicked breaths. The entire extraction took less than 40 seconds. No words were spoken. The efficiency was terrifying. He was tossed into the rear cargo space of the SUV like a piece of dead freight. The metallic slam of the tailgate sealed him in total darkness. As the 5,000-pound vehicle accelerated, the bound man was thrown against the hard plastic paneling. He choked on the smell of exhaust fumes and the fibrous dust of the canvas sack. Every sharp turn, every acceleration amplified his total sensory deprivation. Back at the industrial park, the sole remaining target was still auditing inventory. He stood beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the loading bay, reviewing digital manifests. The heavy steel roll-up doors were secured from the inside. The perimeter cameras hummed quietly. The SUV approached the facility with its headlights extinguished. The operatives knew exactly where the blind spots were. Two men approached the secondary utility door, the same entry point the logistician had previously found unlatched during their surveillance phase. They utilized a heavy hydraulic spreader against the frame to snap the internal deadbolt. The metal groaned under the extreme pressure, followed by a sharp, violent crack that echoed across the empty yard. Inside, the analytical partner froze. He dropped his tablet. The sound was entirely unnatural. It didn't belong in the ambient mechanical noise of a functioning warehouse. He stepped out of the illuminated office into the cavernous, shadowy storage area. The smell of raw diesel and machine grease hung heavy in the air. He called out into the void, expecting a late-shift driver or a negligent security guard. The response was the rapid, heavy thud of tactical boots rushing across the concrete floor. They hit him from the blind side. A solid strike to the ribs drove him to the ground. He collapsed onto a splintered wooden pallet, gasping for oxygen. Before his brain could process the physical trauma, two attackers pinned him. A heavy boot pressed against the back of his neck, grinding his face into the abrasive, dusty floor. He tasted copper. The cold steel barrel of a weapon pressed firmly against his temple. The physical message was absolute. Any resistance would result in an immediate execution. Duct tape was ripped from a roll, a sharp, violent tearing sound, and wound tightly around his eyes and mouth. His wrists were wrenched violently behind his back and bound with industrial plastic cuffs. The men dragged him across the facility. His boots scraped uselessly against the ground. They threw him into a small, windowless utility closet at the back of the warehouse. A moment later, a second heavy body was shoved into the cramped, suffocating space. Through the muffled layers of canvas and tape, he recognized the terrified, ragged breathing of his business partner. The trap had successfully snapped shut on both of them. The attackers moved with practiced, terrifying speed. They didn't rummage for loose cash. They didn't touch the expensive electronics or the high-value cargo sitting on the pallets. They systematically severed the hardline internet connections and smashed the local server hosting the CCTV footage. The warehouse was now a black site. They dragged the charismatic partner out of the closet and hauled him toward a heavy steel support pillar in the center of the warehouse floor. They needed collateral. They needed a visceral, horrifying visual that would force the victims' families into immediate, unquestioning compliance. One of the operatives utilized a heavy baton to deliver calculated, brutal strikes to the restrained man's face and torso. The goal wasn't lethal force, it was maximum cosmetic damage. Blood pooled on the cold concrete. The metallic scent of it mingled with the stagnant warehouse air. Once the victim was battered and drifting in and out of consciousness, an attacker stepped back and raised a burner phone. A harsh camera flash illuminated the dark space for a fraction of a second. That single image, a bruised, bleeding professional chained to an industrial pillar, was the digital payload. The captors finally initiated communication. Their voices were muffled, distorted by heavy fabric masks. They delivered indirect but absolute commands, demanding immediate access to the offshore escrow accounts and the digital keys to the corporate holding funds. The injured man, choking on his own blood, desperately tried to explain the complexities of the financial transfers. He frantically conveyed that moving such massive sums required multi-factor authentication and physical security tokens that were locked inside a downtown bank vault. The attackers rejected the explanation. They applied more physical pressure, utilizing a heavy wrench against his exposed kneecap, demanding immediate workarounds. Locked inside the pitch-black utility closet, the analytical partner listened to the muffled, agonizing screams of his friend. His data-driven mind frantically calculated their odds of survival. He realized with absolute clarity that this wasn't a rapid smash-and-grab robbery. This was an extended, methodical siege. The perpetrators were prepared to occupy the warehouse through the entire weekend, waiting until the financial institutions opened their digital gates on Monday morning. The ambient temperature in the facility continued to drop, chilling the sweat and blood on their skin. The captors established a perimeter inside the building, securing the heavy steel roll-up doors and settling into the office space. The digital image of the bleeding hostage was already being encrypted, prepared for transmission to the outside world. The extortion demand was not set in thousands. It was a multi-million-dollar ultimatum backed by the very real promise of an impending slaughter. The psychological impact of that image on the family was absolute paralysis. They were suddenly thrust into a high-stakes negotiation with invisible adversaries, tasked with liquidating assets they could not instantly access. The logistical reality of moving millions of dollars over a weekend is virtually impossible due to banking algorithms and transfer limits. The captors either failed to understand this economic friction, or they simply did not care, utilizing the impossible deadline to maximize terror. While the relatives agonized in silence, the outside world registered the victim's absence through missed professional markers. By Monday morning, multiple international freight manifests remained unapproved. High-value cargo sat stranded in customs holding areas. This operational paralysis was entirely out of character for the analytical business owner. An associate, alarmed by the unreturned calls and the locked front gates of the facility, contacted the authorities to request a welfare check. Concurrently, the terrified family realized the extortionist demands were mathematically impossible to meet in isolation. They made the agonizing, irreversible decision to break the kidnapper's cardinal rule and presented the digital ransom demand to the authorities. The bureaucratic friction of a standard missing persons report evaporated the moment the photograph was analyzed. The State Crime Command's Robbery and Serious Crime Squad immediately assumed jurisdiction. The precinct transformed into a crisis center. Detectives recognized the extreme escalation in violence. This was a highly organized cell utilizing paramilitary tactics. The investigative focus split into two urgent streams: a frantic physical search of the last known locations and an intensive digital forensic sweep. Cybercrime units attempted to trace the origin of the encrypted message, but the extortionists had routed their digital footprint through a labyrinth of proxy servers scattered across multiple continents. The metadata was scrubbed. Cell tower triangulations provided a single, grim data point. Both victims' mobile devices had ceased broadcasting simultaneously, exactly 3 miles apart, late Friday night. Aviation units deployed thermal imaging cameras over the sprawling 400-acre industrial park where the business was headquartered. Heavily armed tactical teams began quietly canvassing the sector, checking toll booth logs and automated license plate readers along the interstate highways. The grid was massive, a maze of identical corrugated steel structures and abandoned lots. The sheer volume of hiding spaces severely hampered the physical search. Inside the cold, uninsulated warehouse, the reality of the hostage situation devolved into a brutal test of endurance. Over 60 hours had elapsed since the initial breach. The captors severely restricted water and forced their prisoners into agonizing stress positions. The physical degradation was rapid, but the psychological warfare was far more insidious. The perpetrators intentionally isolated the two men, preventing them from communicating or drawing strength from one another. Locked in total darkness, the pragmatic warehouse operator was stripped of his ability to analyze or control his environment. His captors provided intermittent, fabricated updates, indirectly taunting him with claims that the ransom had been rejected or that his family had refused to pay. They utilized severe sensory deprivation to completely shatter his logistical framework. The heavy steel walls blocked all external noise, leaving the hostages with nothing but the low, mechanical drone of industrial refrigeration units and the terrifying sound of heavy boots pacing across the concrete floor. The syndicate's initial cold calculation was beginning to fray. As Monday afternoon progressed, their attempts to force digital transfers utilizing the victim's corporate credentials repeatedly triggered automated fraud prevention lockouts. The $3.5 million goal remained trapped behind impenetrable banking firewalls. The extortionists realized their timeline was collapsing. The hostage holding period is the most volatile phase of any kidnapping. The longer an asset is held, the higher the probability of detection. The tactical discipline of the captors began to crack, replaced by a desperate, aggressive realization that their high-yield extraction was failing. The atmosphere inside the facility shifted from controlled extortion to raw, unpredictable desperation. The Robbery and Serious Crime Squad operated on a foundational statistical premise. Extortion at this extreme financial scale required intimate, insider knowledge. The initial phase of the manhunt bypassed the digital ether entirely, anchoring itself in the physical reality of the victim's immediate professional orbit. Detectives hypothesized that a crime of this logistical precision had to involve a disgruntled subordinate, a marginalized competitor, or a compromised vendor. The first massive allocation of investigative resources was directed toward a former logistics manager. This individual had been forcefully terminated from the warehouse 6 months prior under highly acrimonious circumstances involving missing inventory and falsified manifests. He possessed a documented history of workplace aggression, a deep understanding of the facility's structural blind spots, and a comprehensive, dangerous awareness of the firm's offshore escrow accounts. Investigators tracked the former employee to a transient, heavily dilapidated motel roughly 50 miles north of the city's central business district. Heavily armored tactical units breached the perimeter of the complex just after midnight, deploying flashbangs and anticipating a violent, high-stakes hostage rescue. Instead, they found a heavily intoxicated man weighing nearly 250 pounds, completely oblivious to the tactical assault. During a rigorous, intensely hostile 14-hour interrogation, the suspect provided a verifiable, ironclad alibi. His narrative was thoroughly corroborated by time-stamped surveillance footage from a local dive bar and a continuous sequence of credit card transactions spanning the entire abduction window. The man was abrasive and thoroughly uncooperative, but his innocence regarding the kidnapping was mathematically certain. This dead end represented the first major hemorrhage of precious operational time. Desperate for traction, the task force pivoted to a secondary red herring. Detectives hauled in a private financial auditor who had recently contracted with the firm. The auditor possessed the exact routing numbers for the targeted cryptocurrency wallets and had recently filed for personal bankruptcy. The timeline fit perfectly. Interrogators applied immense psychological pressure, dissecting the auditor's financial records and tracking his vehicular movements. However, GPS telematics from the man's sedan placed him securely at a suburban residence over 80 miles away during the precise moment the digital ransom was transmitted. Another lead disintegrated into dust. Simultaneously, the Cyber Forensics Division collided with a sophisticated digital barricade. The cryptocurrency wallet address embedded in the ransom photograph was subjected to deep packet analysis, revealing a labyrinthine network of decentralized tumbling services. The extortionists were utilizing automated algorithmic scripts to bounce simulated transactions across thousands of global nodes, effectively masking their actual withdrawal architecture. The IP address linked to the encrypted message pinged a secure server farm in Eastern Europe, then bounced to a proxy in Southeast Asia before terminating in a heavily encrypted void. The digital trail was a phantom. Detectives were operating completely blind, hunting a highly organized syndicate that had successfully erased its electronic footprint from the global grid. The frustration within the command center escalated to a fever pitch as the critical 72-hour survival window rapidly closed. Statistically, the probability of recovering abducted assets alive plummets dramatically after the third day. The investigators were physically and mentally exhausted, reviewing the same fragmented data points with diminishing returns. In a desperate bid for new physical evidence, Command ordered a secondary welfare check on the primary business location. 2 uniformed officers in a standard patrol cruiser drove slowly through the sprawling industrial park, sweeping their high-powered halogen spotlights across the massive corrugated steel facades. They noted the heavy, galvanized padlocks on the main perimeter gates and the completely undisturbed front office windows. The ambient temperature was hovering at a freezing 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and the officers, seeing no obvious signs of forced entry at the primary access points, did not exit their vehicle to physically inspect the rear of the structure. They completely missed the breached secondary utility door, which had been meticulously masked behind a rusted, abandoned shipping container positioned deep in the loading bay. The patrol radioed dispatch, reporting the location as secure, locked, and dormant. The officers drove away, leaving the victims trapped in absolute darkness and agonizing pain just 50 feet away from the idling police cruiser. The ultimate midpoint pivot of the investigation did not emerge from high-tech surveillance, satellite tracking, or digital decryption. It surfaced through routine, exhausting clerical diligence. An administrative assistant, interviewed for the 3rd consecutive time by desperate detectives, recalled a minor, seemingly insignificant deviation in the charismatic partner's schedule. She mentioned a highly lucrative, last-minute contract discussed after a logistics symposium several weeks prior. The partner had been unusually secretive about the independent broker's identity, viewing the new contact as a strictly proprietary asset. Detectives immediately executed a subpoena for the guest registers and internal security archives from the high-rise conference center. Analysts spent 6 grueling hours scrubbing high-definition footage of the crowded networking event. Eventually, they isolated the brief interaction between the victim and an unidentified male wearing a tailored dark suit. Facial recognition algorithms were initially defeated by the man's strategic positioning away from direct overhead camera angles, but a microscopic physical detail betrayed his identity. The suspect possessed a distinct asymmetrical scar along his left jawline, barely visible under the ambient, low-temperature lighting of the hotel lobby. Cross-referencing this highly specific biometric marker against the state's organized crime database generated a single catastrophic match. The customs broker was a documented enforcer for a localized, highly volatile extortion ring, an individual with a lengthy dossier detailing violent debt collection, severe physical assault, and witness intimidation. He was not an independent logistician. He was an apex predator. This identification cracked the bedrock of the syndicate's operational security. Warrants were instantly authorized to pull historical, localized cell tower data for the enforcer's known criminal associates. The digital dragnet successfully captured a concentrated burst of encrypted radio traffic occurring exactly at the time of the initial abduction. The data analysts isolated a specific frequency hopping pattern and relentlessly traced its geographic origin. The resulting coordinates defied every standard protocol of a kidnapping for ransom. Hostages are traditionally transported to secondary, heavily fortified locations, remote rural properties, dense forest tracts, or abandoned subterranean structures to insulate the captors from the initial high-risk crime scene. But the cell tower triangulation did not point to a distant rural compound located hundreds of miles outside the jurisdiction. The signal was broadcasting directly from a macrocell transmitter located on the roof of the victim's own industrial park. The realization hit the command center like a physical shockwave. The perpetrators had never initiated a vehicular transfer out of the sector. The heavy, dark SUV captured on the peripheral highway. Traffic cameras had been a deliberate, calculated decoy, driven away completely empty to lay a false trail for the authorities. The extortionists had simply breached the warehouse, neutralized the internal surveillance grid, and barricaded themselves inside the sprawling 4,000 square foot facility with their targets. They had weaponized the victim's own fortress of commerce, transforming it into a concrete black site. The entire manhunt had been outward-facing, projecting massive resources across hundreds of miles of interstate highway and scanning international digital networks, while the absolute epicenter of the violence had remained completely stationary. The uniformed patrol had literally driven past the ongoing torture. The isolation of the victims was profound, achieved not by geographical distance or remote geography, but by hiding in plain sight within the deafening silence of an empty industrial grid. The operational tempo inside the precinct shifted instantaneously from investigative analysis to immediate, overwhelming tactical deployment. Heavily armored intervention units mobilized, loading into unmarked transport vehicles. Designated snipers acquired elevated overwatch positions on the rooftops of the adjacent textile plants. The command center authorized a dynamic, explosive breach. The objective was no longer to negotiate, stall for time, or gather intelligence. The singular, violent priority was to shatter the concrete walls of the warehouse and neutralize the threat before the captors realized their digital shroud had finally been pierced. The tactical breach was executed at 3:14 a.m. Heavily armored units obliterated the warehouse's main roll-up doors using shaped charges. The concussive blast shattered the remaining glass in the office, instantly neutralizing any chance of organized resistance. The extortionists were pinned to the concrete floor within seconds, their digital fortress physically dismantled. Deep inside the utility closet, the hostages were found bound and severely dehydrated, suffering from acute physical trauma. They had survived nearly 80 hours of profound sensory deprivation in near-freezing temperatures, held captive inside their own business. The subsequent legal proceedings spanned late 2024 into early 2025. The prosecution presented a crushing volume of evidence: encrypted server logs, localized cell tower metadata, and the visceral photographs utilized in the ransom demand. Defense attorneys attempted to argue jurisdictional technicalities and challenge the digital forensic methods, but the physical reality of the heavily fortified crime scene proved insurmountable. The trial laid bare the syndicate's absolute detachment from human empathy. The testimonies highlighted a sociopathic methodology that viewed living individuals strictly as liquid assets, ATMs, to be battered until they dispensed millions. Recognizing the overwhelming forensic proof, the cell leader and his primary enforcer pleaded guilty to aggravated kidnapping and extortion just days before the jury was seated. The presiding judge handed down maximum sentences without the possibility of early release, citing the extreme cruelty and calculated premeditation of the industrial siege. The psychological toll of those 80 hours extends far beyond healed fractures and faded bruising. Thomas and Tan returned to a reality that feels fundamentally altered. The concrete facility, once the undeniable proof of their relentless ambition and familial duty, now stands as a silent monument to their absolute vulnerability. Upgraded steel doors and enhanced perimeter alarms offer no genuine psychological comfort. The extortion syndicate didn't simply orchestrate a physical abduction. They permanently shattered the foundational illusion of safety. In the high-stakes arena of global logistics, accumulated wealth is designed to provide insulation from the outside world. Yet for two men barricaded inside their own commercial sanctuary, success merely illuminated them as prey. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.